Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody who's in this room and those who are joining us virtually. So this is the second roundtable that we are organizing in this series on gender evaluation and empowerment. And Clear South Asia, in partnership with the community of evaluators and UN Women, is organizing this series. This is part of a larger roundtable series that Clear South Asia organizes, and this is the 9th one in that series, right? The idea, for those of you who were here in November when we had the first roundtable in the gender and evaluation, was that we wanted to create, we really felt that there was a need for a more, regular sharing of information and knowledge on amongst the practitioners, researchers, evaluators, from the field of gender and evaluation. So those of us who are working in this field to come here with our examples and showcase some of our work, talk about the challenges and also how do we go about addressing them. The theme for the first roundtable was more, we delved more into defining the concept of empowerment and really understanding what we mean when we're talking about women's empowerment and and then also coming up with a framework for how do we go about measuring them. So moving on from that, from that first roundtable, the theme for this roundtable is on measurement. And we will have a presentation from 3 experts in this field who will be showing, presenting examples of their work and really focusing on some of the challenges that one addresses in trying to capture empowerment, women's empowerment. We will focus on the challenges and also how do we address them in different sectors and in different regions, because this is something that we had a very interesting discussion last time, was that the concept of empowerment actually is very different depending on the project, the sector, or the area that that you're working in. So. Hopefully, at the end of when we have an open round of discussion, I hope that we can focus more on the measurement issue. But really, the message that I think that we would like to focus on is that yes, there are challenges in measuring empowerment. There are a lot of challenges that we all know, researchers who are working in this area. But it is possible to come up with solutions with which are reasonable, which are appropriate in the context in which we are conducting the particular evaluation and the research and in the sector in which we are working. So that really should be, I think that would be sort of the focus that we would like in this roundtable. We have 3 presenters, as I mentioned earlier, that we have Dr. Tarun Jain from the Indian School of Business. Dr. Tarun Jain has a PhD in economics and he works on labor and development economics. His current research project includes evaluation of school-based gender sensitization program on gender attitudes and outcomes, and he will be presenting a paper on measuring gender attitudes in schools, lessons from Haryana. We have our second speaker is Dr. Charity Troyer-Moore from IFMR, and she's a senior researcher and policy manager at IFMR and a research fellow at the Kennedy School of Evidence for Policy Design. She's based in India and is the country manager for the DFID-funded Building Capacity to Use Research Evidence program. She's currently managing a project examining how the MG Narega program impacts female empowerment in Madhya Pradesh and India. She has also worked in the past with the World Bank and with UNDP to examine cash transfer programs in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. The topic of her presentation is Behind the Veil, Measuring Female Empowerment in Madhya Pradesh, India. Our final speaker for today is Urvashi Vatal from the Catalyst Management Services. Urvashi has been working with CMS since 2012 as a consultant focusing on mixed method evaluation design. She works across a range of thematic sectors including education, gender-based violence, sex-selective elimination, early marriage, capacity building for women, social inclusion, and water resource management. She has a master's from the Tata Institute of Social Science and Development Studies, and she's going to be presenting on qualitative research with children on gender norms. After every presentation, we will have a very short Q&A session. And we'll have a longer time at the end for a more open discussion. We will have closing remarks by Catherine Hay. I don't think I need to introduce Catherine Hay. She's a very familiar, well-known figure for those of us who are working in evaluation in South Asia. Catherine is working as a senior program officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she's specifically well-known to those of us who are working on women's issues in this region. So Catherine's going to give the closing remarks, and Urmi Shukla, who is the capacity building manager at Clear South Asia, she's going to be moderating the Q&A session. Thank you. So, okay.
Okay, so I want to just thank the organizers for inviting me to present. This is, based on a survey that we've just completed, and just got our data in place. So I'm very excited to present this. It's the first time that we're really, putting it out and having a chance to also not only present our findings, but also get some feedback on what we've done and see, what you guys think about it. So what we're going to do is to talk more about a survey that we did, but it's also part of a larger evaluation. So let me give a little bit of context of what we're trying to evaluate, what program or idea is underpinning all of this, because not least because some of the other presenters are also going to, Urvashi I know is also going to talk pretty much about the same program. And so, the basic idea over here is that we all might recognize that there's extensive discrimination against women, which is perhaps, all throughout the life cycle. It starts from, sex-selective elimination of fetuses, of small children, but it also continues in terms of education or health investments, in terms of what happens in the marriage market, what happens in old age, and so this is a sort of all throughout the life cycle this discrimination happens. But on the other hand, if you see most policy measures, they constitute some version of carrots and sticks, right? So there is encouragement in terms of like scholarships for girls, but at the same time there might be sticks like anti-dowry legislation, right? But if you look at most of evaluations of those kinds of policy measures, largely the answer is that those policy measures don't work. You don't see a lot of effectiveness of those policy measures. So the question becomes, on what basis, so how can we sort of, tackle this problem more holistically? And one way to potentially look at this problem is to look at basic underlying attitudes of society towards women. Now, the problem over here is that if you look at the attitudes amongst adults, they tend to be very stable, right? So your attitudes as a 20-year-old are pretty much going to be your attitudes throughout your life cycle. They're not going to change a lot, and it's very difficult to come up with good ways to change those attitudes. So the idea over here is that, there might be a relatively small window of changing attitudes amongst adolescents, right? So children, say under 10, they're too young, they don't understand the notion of gender attitudes. Once you hit 20, basically you're going to have stable attitudes for the rest of your life. So you want to hit them in a time when attitudes are fairly malleable, and there's a window of opportunity to do that. And so the question that we're trying to ask is, can a school-based gender sensitization program actually change attitudes? Right? So now we're economists, we're going to evaluate this program. As such, we don't know how to change anyone's attitudes, but fortunately we found someone who does, and that's Breakthrough, right? So many of you might be familiar with Breakthrough. They're going to design and implement a program over the next 2 years in 4 districts, in schools based in 4 districts in Haryana. These four districts are in some ways are the 4 districts which have the worst child sex ratio in Haryana. So. And they're going to implement this program in 150 schools. So we're going to use those as the treatment schools, and we've also found a bunch of control schools which look a lot like the treatment schools. And we're going to compare what happens and see if this program is effective in changing children's attitudes and students' attitudes. The program is going to be largely based on 7th, 8th, and 9th grades in these government schools. So, in Haryana, there was lots of private schools as well. About 50% of the students go to private schools, but we're only going to concentrate on government schools, Right, so that's the program. Here's Delhi, most of you know, and here like Panipat, Sonipat, Rohtak, and Jhajjar, and all those dots are where all those schools are located. We have GPS coordinates and all that. So just to give you a sense for where this is. And so we're going to use, now that we have a nice treatment and control, you can be assured that it was randomly chosen, stratified random choice. We have a randomized control trial in place, right? So we are going to use compare the treatment and the control both before and after. And so now that we have to compare that, we're thinking about, well, you really want to target attitudes. So you need to measure attitudes at baseline, right? So that's the problem. And so the central problem that we faced as researchers is, how do we measure gender attitudes amongst the thousands of students who are enrolled in these schools, right? And these are all relatively young students, right? And do it in a way that is statistically valid, robust, so on and so forth, right? So, for a bunch of different challenges emerge over here. So one is that, what's an appropriate test that measures gender attitudes amongst 10 to 14-year-olds, right? So we look in the literature, we don't find a lot of stuff. We want it to be very robust to context. So remember what these schools look like. So here's a picture of the schools, right? So here a bunch of and here are some more pictures of schools. So you can see that these schools, as such, they're fairly gender segregated. The girls sit on one side of the room, the boys sit on the other side. There's a guy in a wheelchair. He's also sitting with the boys, right? So we want this tests, whatever measure we come up to be robust to the context of these schools, rural schools in Haryana. We want it to be relatively reliable. It should not be that you use a certain metric, a certain test, you go back and repeat it for the same person, you're going to get a wildly different answer, right? Then you're just getting noise, right? So you want it to be somewhat reliable every time you do it. If similar people, you use it, you get somewhat similar answers, right? You also, every time you're trying to measure someone's attitudes in a way that people realize that they're being measured, you want to avoid social desirability bias. You can't just ask direct questions and think that people will give you very honest answers, right? Because they might want to please the person who's asking those questions. And then, of course, there are some very practical challenges of implementing. So we are going to roll out our study. So we were going to survey more than 13,000, 14,000 students. How do you come up with a good way to measure attitudes amongst these students? So there's issues of scope. There are very large number of respondents. It's a school-based environment. The schools are geographically dispersed. There's geographical problems. There's personnel problems, right? So you can't come up with very sophisticated metrics because you don't have the right set of people to go out and do those, right? So we hired more than 80 enumerators. We have some very capable research assistants, but unfortunately they weren't able to go out and do measure every kind. Ultimately, you have to think about who the people who are going to implement stuff is. And then, of course, we have time constraints and expense constraints as well. So you have to come up with good ways to measure attitudes. So how are you going to do that, right? So we settled on 3 different ways that we thought would help unlock this puzzle. One is a vignette. The other is just asking direct attitude questions. And so there were some challenges to that. I'm going to talk about those. And finally, I'm going to talk about an adaptation to the implicit association test and see how that stacks up in our way. So, we also, I think having multiple measures is important, simply because then you're also able to triangulate your results and see if you have come up with consistent answers. So here's the vignette. So we basically tell kids a story. We tell this early in the interview, right? So they like stories. They like responding to stories. So here's a story about a lower middle class family. They have 2 kids. They're twins, a boy and a girl. And the father is faced with the decision on which kid to send to the town for higher studies. And so going to town will require them to stay in a hostel. They're financially constrained, and so finally the father decides that the boy should go to continue his studies, whereas the girl will stay home and eventually get married, right? So this is a story that we tell kids. The kids love the story, right? And then they're asked a bunch of questions about the story. Do you agree with this decision? Right? And so this is very interesting. So you see that, of course, many people seem to agree, but mostly the majority of individuals who seem to agree are the boys, right? So rather than the girls. Who would you send to the school, right? So now you've given the student the decision-making power. Who would you send? And now you still see that the boys prefer to send the boy, and the girls would prefer to send the girl, right? So you see some vignette responses along that line. If you asked, who would you send to school? The girl? Yeah, so the girls switch over. So in some ways it's consistent, right? That you have the boys preferring the boys, and the girls in some ways actually show a preference for sending the girl. But is it that it's somehow the perception that girls or boys are better students? We can investigate those questions as well. So you can see that, here we tip the scales in favor of the girl and say that what if she was the better student? Would you still send the boy? And it seems that the boys still prefer that idea. We can also ask questions on why they feel that this is an important decision, right? So what are the drivers for preferring boys versus girls? And so we can ask questions about whether it's staying alone in the town is not safe for girls, or is it that, well, the girl is of the age that you should get married, and so we can ask questions like that as well and see what the responses are like. Right. So we also asked questions on just directly asking questions on what are your gender attitudes, right? So we can ask a woman's most important role is being a good homemaker, and so initially we said, well, let's stay standard with the literature and put in place a 5-point scale, right? So do you strongly agree, are you neutral, do you disagree, or do you strongly disagree? And we basically got blank stares, right? So we got nothing. And so a big problem was that these 5-point scale, as it is, if you just read out, even if you translate well in Hindi, doesn't really work. So here's how the survey takes place, and we basically were getting a lot of noise. We couldn't understand what was going on. And one issue was that students are shy. They don't really know how to express this notion of strongly agree already. So we came up with a nice way to help the students just interact much more with the enumerator, right? So, and here's your strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. And so we adapted this from one of the USSR surveys, which also used this in one of their studies, and we said, look, this works pretty well with young kids, and we actually got lots of nice responses. So here's another, and so you can see this girl is holding her little 5-point scale right there, right, and giving responses. And so now we get questions. You can see results like, if you ask a general questions, girls should be allowed to study as far as they want. Yeah, sure, 90%, both boys and girls. Even the parents agree on this. But when you say that wives should be less educated than their husbands, then we have this discrepancy. And so this is interesting to find out that, yes, in the abstract, girls should study as much as they want. But clearly, these two things can't be simultaneously true. So, this is, I think, yielding some interesting results. So the final measure that I'm going to talk about is this implicit association test. Right, so this is a test that was developed in basically psychology labs in the US. Right, so the idea is over here. You are going to measure how people associate different ideas together. So and see how fast they do this. Right, so so think of it this way. So how fast do you associate, say, women with humanities and men with engineering, compared to men with humanities and women in the engineering? Right. So if you basically do the first comparison faster than the second one, that tells us something about it, right? So the underlying principle is a straightforward one. Your mind works much faster when you're telling the truth than when you're having to lie, right? So lies take longer, and so we can measure this with our computer-based test, right? And so you basically have a categorization, a task that is to be done quickly. It's all computer-based. So we're measuring the response time in microseconds, or milliseconds. And so the software is really helpful in that. And so the nice thing over here is that because it's not a response, it's not a thought-out response, it's a very fast-moving response, it helps us overcome our social desirability bias, right? Now the big problem over here is that it's extremely sensitive to the context. So what words and language that you use has a big effect on whether the IIT works or not, right? And so the problem for us was that there were lots of examples of, say, measuring race discrimination in the US, or other kinds of discrimination in different contexts, but no IIT which was appropriate for measuring gender attitudes amongst 10 to 14-year-olds in government schools in Haryana. So we created one. Right, so a lot of piloting went into this, but I think we came up with. So we had like lots of words that we could use. So the two categories that we were trying to associate together were boys versus girls. Right, so that's obvious. That's the gender dimension. And so the other one was basically a set of good words and bad words. Right, so lots of piloting to go on selecting what are the good words and bad words in this context. So acha and bura are really nice words, but bad luck is something that seemed to be universally seen as a bad word, right? So you would never want to wish bad luck on anyone. And so now what you have to do is to categorize this word with on the right hand side or the left hand side, right? And so, and then you have to do this, left or right, and this, left or right, and this, a good word, right? Left or right. But we're comparing this with another set of trials, right? So bad word, left or right. What's different between this and the first one? What's different is that look at these categories. This is girl associated with good words and boys associated with bad words, compared to the previous case when the boys were associated with the good words and the girls were associated with the bad words, right? So that is where we cause mental dissonance, and that's how we pick up whether or not you're telling what you truly believe or you're trying to make up of it, right? So here's the boy, here's the girl, here's the good word again, right? So here's a bunch of pictures. Here's a picture of a girl taking the IIT. It's very popular, by the way. The students who are taking the IIT love taking the IIT. So, you know, the other nice thing, and so we can also administer it very quickly. It doesn't take a lot of time. We set up a small video instruction to tell them how this is going to be played. And then we also use a simple version of the association, say associating fruits and insects and allocating them appropriately, just to go through this process of how familiarizing every respondent on what's going to actually happen, so that, you know, the students all of whom have heard about computers, all of whom have seen computers, and most of whom have seen computers lying uselessly in their computer labs in school, right? Now actually, you know, but they might not be familiar with actually typing in. So they were able to have some practice before they took the actual IIT. It didn't take a lot of time. And the other great thing is that we were able to get a lot of these done. So just quickly talk about some of the results. So this D measure is basically the amount of time that it takes to associate a boy with a good word, right? And so, or the reverse of that. So it tells you how much implicit preference you have for time, right? So it's the reverse of the amount of time that it takes you. And so what you see is that the boys basically associate boy with good words really fast. What happens with the girls? They actually switch around. They associate, what's happening? So they associate girls with good words very quickly and boys with bad words really quickly, right? So what you see is that in some ways the underlying implicit associations are switched around for boys and girls, right? So the other thing we've been checking in the last few weeks is whether or not these measures that we get from, say, the direct attitude questions line up with what we learned from the IIT, right? So this is very important for us to do. And we basically find that there's a strong correlation of these measures across the IIT and the direct attitude questions, about the vignette and the IIT, the vignette and the direct attitude questions. So the three measures, the three tests that we've put together have ultimately the same answer, right? So the final thing I'd say is that what I like about the IIT and all of the other two measures, the direct questions and the vignette, we were able to get this done with thousands of students, right? So the number of students who took the IIT is more than 5,000. The number of students who responded to the direct attitude questions and the vignette, more than 14,000, right? And so we were able to get this done. And so that, to me, is a sign of success of, you know, the different measures that we've come up with. So this is what I have, and, you know, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, I guess, yeah. Okay, so there's a mic as well. So.
Hi, just a quick question about this last, the IIT. I work at Asar Center, and one of the things that we do is the Asar survey every year, which tells us that a lot of children, even in classes 6, 7, 8, 9, can't read. This test clearly is computer-based, and children would have had to read those questions.
Yeah.
Did you find that a lot of children were not able to do it because they were not able to read the questions? Or, I mean, was there any relationship between their reading ability and the speed at which they were answering these questions?
So we haven't, so we didn't independently measure their reading ability. You can see that first in the test, what you have to read is a fairly straightforward word. You don't have to read a sentence. right? So perhaps that helps mitigate some of the issues. A lot of the instructions are also, so you can see that the student has to read the instructions, but we also have video instructions to overcome this problem. Right? So because the instructions might be complicated, so we also have a video to explain the instructions, and then they also play this fruits versus insects IIT as a pilot, and so that also hopefully helps address this issue of whether they understand how to play the game or not. Yeah, I think there was a question there earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Tarun. I am from IPF South Asia region here. Thank you so much for the very interesting kind of workout that you have done. A couple of thoughts which I had, one, you talked about measuring gender attitudes among children. Yeah, so I would kind of second to what my friend said here. Primarily in terms of, let's say, you talk about, you have focused more on the government schools. So there is an issue of understanding, number one. And I will go beyond that, saying, you talked about talking to them about women, about how a woman relates to that. So the understanding itself could be an issue for those school kids. That could be, a kind of thought, because I was also involved in one of these, and there was a serious issue of me as a kid, 10 to 14 years, understanding about women or things like that, or sexual health or reproductive health and all that. So there is one thing which I thought, and this study which you talked about focused only on a girl child, or it was a mix of
okay, so I should perhaps clarify some of the questions. So we don't ask about sexual health to 10 and 11-year-olds. So it's a question of what are specifically the types of questions that we ask, and I think so the vignette I think was fairly straightforward, right? So it had to do with the father making a decision on which kids to send to for higher studies, right? So then we also have questions like women should be less educated than their husbands. This is a social norm. Parents should give dowry for the girl's marriage, or men and women should get equal opportunities in all spheres of life, right? So so largely we think that the students understand these questions. They seem the enumerators, of course, are trained to convey the questions in a very sort of context specific way, as well as in a very soft way, so that students are comfortable answering them. Finally, I think in some ways what you're saying is that if the students don't understand the questions at all, our data would just be noise, right? And so it's in some ways it helps us, of course, ex post understand that the students did understand some things because we get consistent patterns with the data, right? Question, yeah.
It's okay.
Finally, I'd also say that we extensively piloted all of this stuff, right? So that also helps for us to learn whether or not students in general understand these questions. And so what you see is the English translation. You don't see the Haryanvi translation.
Hi, Tarun. Just a quick clarification. What is the D measure? And the second thing is, if I understood correctly, what you found then in the IIT test is essentially what you're finding is there is a gender difference in the attitude. It's not necessarily that the negative perceptions are towards the girls.
Right.
So it could be that it's not necessarily. So the girls would have a negative perception towards the boys, and the boys would have a negative perception towards the girls. So there is a gender difference, but not necessarily biased in any particular direction.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's to answer your first question, the D measure. I mean, I think this is pointless jargon. It's basically a discrimination measure, right? So it will tell you who you are favoring, right? And so so there's a algorithm which takes the seconds responses, right? The millisecond response differences in responses across the two categories, and generates these measures. I can talk about them in more detail, but basically it's the difference in types, right? So at the very basic level, and then we, so if you take 10 seconds to respond, we throw that answer out, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Hi, Tarun. I have two questions. The first one is that, in a lot of surveys that we have done, we find a significant number of women or girls who themselves are conditioned to a lot of stereotypes and biases. So I would be interested to find out if within boys, you found boys who had different attitudes towards girls and women, and vice versa within women. That's one question. The second is, how long do you expect these attitudes to sustain? Obviously, after school, when the kids pass out, they go to college, they have friends, they start working. So to my mind, this should have been a cohort study, where you could measure in their real lives, did they actually marry or did they actually go and finish up the higher education?
Right.
Is that happening?
Okay, so there are two ways to answer your question. That yes, you're absolutely right. That there's an age gradient over here. So one way in which we're going to measure the age gradient is to follow these students in the for over many years. We have another one planned for 2016 for the same students, or at least the same schools. It might be a different mix of students within the same schools, but we expect that the results will be consistent over there. And so
beyond 2016, maybe 2023.
Yes, of course. We would like to. The other way to answer your question is that we also look at the parents. And so, yes, a lot of this, what your hypothesis is that you look at mothers versus fathers, and yes, you see big differences between parents' attitudes and mothers and fathers' attitudes versus boys and girls' attitudes. That's it. Yeah. I'm going to take questions as long as you permit. Yes, Jared.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you. I'm just curious with the implicit association test, did you think about or actually pilot any other versions that use words besides good and bad? Because I could see that kind of playing into the results that you would get.
No, so we wanted to make it as simple as possible. So that's why we chose a basic good versus bad category. Now, within good versus bad, there are many words you could have
Yeah, I would think like
chosen. And
rich or poor or something like that.
Exactly, rich or poor. And so, depending on who you are, you might think of rich people as good people or rich people as bad people, right? So clearly, so the words we ultimately ended up using were the least controversial and most clearly identifiable. So you can't have multiple values associated with each word, and so you have to throw those words out. So we started with a large list of words, and actually when we were piloting in these schools, there would be teachers who would pick up on what we were doing and say, "Oh, that's not a good word. Let me tell you a better word." Right, and so that was very helpful actually. So piloting is absolutely critical. Right.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to know, will you use the same type of test during the end line, or you will change the questions on attitudes? Because for the first two tests, there may be a bias if you ask the same set of questions and same set of story. So will you be using the same set of things?
So so it's not a panel by student; it's a panel by school.
Okay.
Right. So we'll go back to the same school and perhaps just draw. So within the school we randomly draw 45 odd students. It might yield a different set of students, right? But we do plan to use pretty much the same set of questions. Otherwise, you can't directly compare.
Certainly, if
between
the
baseline
respondents
and
change, then it makes sense. Certainly makes sense.
Sure, but sometimes you'll have the same respondent, but then we can learn something, whether or not they're remembering that in 2013 there's a gift. So we can compare those who were common between the baseline and endline, and compare those to those who are not, and learn something to answer your question.
Also, I want to know whether you have seen that there's a difference in terms of religious composition out there, because there's a huge difference among Hindus and Muslims about the attitudes.
So we have data on religion, we haven't looked at it yet.
So I think we can take one more question, and then we could reserve the rest of the questions for the greater Q&A towards the end.
Hi, I'm Vardhini from UNDP. My question was, among these three, tests which you have used, which is the one which the students preferred? Which did they find easier to?
They found the IIT
answer
video to be a lot of fun, and they wanted to take the IIT. Am I right? There you go. So in that sense, but the vignette is easy to answer. For the direct questions, sometimes they felt confused. They felt that they didn't have the facility to answer those questions. That's of course true, which is why we try to help them answer by coming up with our smileys chart. And so there's a clear ranking to it.
So were the respondents for all the three, common in some ways?
Yes, they were. Yeah. So the same student who took the IIT would also take the other two tests. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So next we have Urushi Wattal, who will also be speaking about how to look at and capture gender norms amongst children.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Urvashi. I work at Catalyst Management Services, and I'm going to be presenting on some qualitative methods that we've used at CMS to undertake gender evaluations where gender issues are considered. And one of these researches is which Tarun already spoke about, the study in Haryana on gender roles and norms, where we did the qualitative research, and some of the other tools that we've used in the past in similar areas. The topic that's in the agenda is slightly changed. The study with the children is the one which we did in Haryana, but we've brought in some other tools into this discussion as well. So to start off with, CMS is a professional services company. It's been working for the last 2 decades in the development sector. And we work to enable organizations to maximize the social value that they can provide to the communities they work with. And we do this by providing them insights and evidences in their work. And we facilitate, using these insights and evidences, we facilitate transformation in these organizations, in their systems, structures, and in their ideas. The services that we're providing include planning, strategy development, impact assessments, monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, research, HR and OD, documentation, communication, and financial assurance systems. And we work across a very number of themes, including health, livelihoods, education, governance, disaster risk reduction, and several others that are listed here. We have undertaken some purely qualitative research in the past as well, and one of them is the Haryana study. But we've also done a lot of work in mixed methods, and these studies have had different types of weightage for qualitative and quantitative methods, and different ways of mixing them as well. So today I'm going to primarily talk about 4 tools that we've used in the past. We have used the first one, which is the body mapping tool, to understand gender roles among school-going children for a project in Haryana, which Tarun spoke about. We've used the polling booth, which is a tool used to collect information anonymously where social desirability bias is involved. And we've recently used this in 2 studies on domestic violence and early marriage. The third tool that we've used is a Venn diagram, which is a PI technique to understand relative importance of access to and satisfaction with services, and also to identify areas of exclusion with respect to these services. And finally, we've used tools to get a participatory definition of indicators of progress or empowerment, which is the 4th one I'm going to talk about. So the first one is the body map, which was used in the Haryana study in the 4 districts that Tarun had mentioned earlier. And the body map was used to basically understand how students in these schools understood gender roles and the differences between boys and girls, and what their perceptions of equality and gender roles was. This was done by separating the boys into one group and the girls into another group, and each group had to draw an outline of a boy and a girl. And they would use the different body parts on the chart as takeoff points to discuss various issues and differences between boys and girls in terms of their mobility, where all they can go to, what resources they have access to, the kind of activities they can participate in relative to boys, or then their perception of what society thinks of them, what society thinks of girls and boys, and what they feel about these perceptions and what they say about them. This is followed up with questions about their perceptions of these differences. And the facilitator in the activity also observes their engagement with each other, their interactions, and their body language during the exercise. So I'm just going to quickly present some of the findings that emerged from the study. There's a lot more material on it, and if there are more questions, we can address them in the Q&A. But one of the things that we found through this tool was that children were able to openly discuss these issues using this method. We've done research before where we worked with children, and it is very difficult to get them to speak about these issues, but using this method where there's more interaction, we were able to get them to openly discuss a lot of complex and issues that generally they won't speak about. For example, many points regarding discrimination between boys and girls, sexual arousal, gender inequalities, which are not raised in direct interviews, got captured here. So you have responses such as when a woman is pregnant with a girl, she is not given nutritious food. Or the boys would say that they use their hands to jerk off and their hearts start pounding when they see a girl. And a lot of their responses also included a certain amount of pride in harassing girls or teasing them, in hitting girls. And so while they knew that these are bad things to do, there was still a sense of pride in the way they spoke about these things. If a girl gets hurt badly, then she doesn't have access to proper medication, and there's a discrimination in terms of health and treatment that's available to her as well. So girls articulate a lot more in a lot more detail about the restrictions that are placed on them in terms of mobility, in terms of the friends that they can go and speak with, and where they have to stay within the house. But the boys are also aware of these restrictions on girls. They don't have any opinion on it. The girls may have an opinion, but the boys don't articulate any opinion on these differences, even though they know of it. And even though most of these differences are thought of as unfair, the boys and girls tend to accept this as a part of societal norms. They don't really challenge these. So the next tool that I'm going to talk about is the polling booth, which is a tool that we use to capture sensitive information where there's strong social desirability bias involved. These include sex and sexuality, left-wing extremism, age at marriage, and domestic violence, as I mentioned earlier. This is done by creating an environment where small groups of respondents have to answer yes and no questions through a mechanism where the confidentiality of the response is maintained. So you get a number of yes and no responses, but you don't know who has given the yes and who has said no to each question asked. This was developed by Mahila Samakhya and CMS in 2002 and 3. And it since then has covered 30,000 participants in different studies. And we most recently used this in a study that we did for Breakthrough on domestic violence. And here, it was the polling booth was used independently. It was just used to collect information on incidents of domestic violence, and some of the data from the polling booth is reported here. So we've captured things like how many of the participants reported being beaten or slapped, facing sexual advances and rape within the home, facing threats, or being deprived from food, sleep, and medicines. Prior to this study, we've also used the polling booth as an entry point into having a more detailed focus group discussion. So the themes that will be discussed later on in the FGD will be covered in the polling booth, and that's used as a starting off point. Here it was a purely, the polling booth was used independently so that we could cover a larger number of participants. We covered 1,050 participants across, it says 4, but it's actually 6 districts in UP and Karnataka. The third tool that I'm going to talk about is the Venn diagram. This is a PRI technique that we've used, we've not used it extensively in evaluations, but we've used it in other researches. And the way this is done is there's a circle that's drawn in a community group in the center, which represents a community, and then the group is asked to identify sort of the services and institutions that they generally access or need to access. And those services and institutions are represented by circles. The size of a circle is used to represent the criticality of that service to the group. Its distance from the center is used to signify the level of access that's available to the participants. And the color of the circle is coded so that various levels of satisfaction represent different colors in the coding system. And what we do with this tool is to then measure how different groups access these services differently, and the level of access available to them and how important they are. So the group themselves decide which are the critical services and then give a response on whether they have access to it and how satisfied they are with it. And by comparing the same exercise across different groups and over time, we can see whether there's been any change in access to these services. So this is a tool that can be used separately for men and women to sort of measure relative levels of empowerment. This is a final tool that I'll be discussing. It's a measures of livelihood tool, which where each household in a village is ranked on a 5-point scale with respect to 5 capitals, which is human, social, physical, natural, and financial. The community itself defines what is the number 1 on that 5-point scale and what is number 5. So for example, in terms of the physical asset, you could have the community defining the indicators based on the number of rooms in the household, the presence of certain vehicles, what type of material is used in the roof, the kind of power that's available, whether they have 2 or 3 bulbs or they have no power at all, and the type of cooking stove that's available in the house. So the community defines what is, for them, the best house in terms of physical asset and what is the worst of house in terms of physical assets. And it's the same for all the other 4 capitals. And therefore, different communities would give different indicators for their own progress. And these can then be aggregated at the program level to measure empowerment. Another example is how empowerment was designed in a project by Mahila Samakhya, which we've worked with. This technique was developed by Mahila Samakhya in collaboration with Srilata Batliwala. And a definition of empowerment for women that emerged from this was the angle of the eye to the ground. So what they basically said was that whether a woman can maintain eye contact with the Gram Pradhan or whether she's looking down is an indicator of how empowered she is. If she has confidence, then she will look him straight in the eye when interacting with him. And if not, then she might be looking at the ground or looking sideways when interacting. And that was their definition of empowerment. And so we have, using participatory tools, you can get these indicators of empowerment that are different from what might be covered in a traditional interview. So in conclusion, we have sort of these main points that we thought of. The first is that gender issues and gender roles are very complex and need to be understood in depth. And some of these qualitative techniques can enable probing and observations of reactions of the participants, their body language, which may not be possible in a traditional interview format. With children, open-ended interviews and FGDs have limitations. Techniques which allow the children to interact more, to be more engaged in the exercise, provide better results and get levels of information that we may not be able to access otherwise. So, thank you. If there are any questions, you have received that.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Oh, is the mic? Oh, okay, great.
Just a curiosity about the body mapping and where you had separate sessions for boys and girls. Did girls talk about sexual arousal?
No. Actually, I have the team that has worked more on this, Siddhi and Vasundhara. They were involved in, Vasundhara was on the field and Siddhi has worked on the tool, so they also would probably know more of the responses that came out of it. So if there are any other questions.
So for me, that's very telling of the gender, freedom in talking about sex.
Sexuality, yeah.
Hi. Those are very interesting techniques. I'm just wondering about how you need certain sorts of people with certain sorts of training to be able to do these well and get good information out of them. So could you tell us a little bit about what sorts of people you have used to actually go into the field and do these things, and what sort of training you actually provide to them?
Do you want to answer that?
I think one of the biggest challenges of doing things like this is to find the right kind of people who are able to really facilitate at that level. One of the things is we don't do large numbers because clearly one is that you have to have people with that kind of those skills to be able to do that. The other thing is also that this is quite in-depth. So each of those, the exercises with children and all were taking sometimes 1.5 hours. So the kind of information that also then comes out and to be able to capture that and analyze that and all is also important. And then finally, we do find that once we go from one school to the second school to the third school, slowly there is a concept saturation in terms of the information. In response to the specific thing that you've asked, so we do really, in this case, because we were going to schools, we wanted young people, because we find that if I were to go to a school, for instance, I would be looked on as a parent or a teacher figure. And so the kind of reaction that the children would have would probably not be as, talking about sexual arousal and things like that might really be something that they wouldn't be able to do. So you do have to have people who are young and who are able to connect to children. And that was the main thing that we were really thinking of. And then we take them to a training where we make them understand about the project. And it's very important for them to know what is it that we're looking for, what are the objectives, and how are we going to try and get that. We did have a pilot, as they also had done earlier, to really see what is happening. Are the tools really being able to capture things that one wouldn't be able to capture through a normal survey. So those were actually the main things. And then it comes to documentation, because a lot of loss happens during documentation. So we would like to have people who can document well. But we do tell them that, look, even if you're documenting in your local language, it's okay. Even if you're writing in Hindi, we'll kind of figure it out and get the English afterwards, because that again becomes another challenge for us when we are doing these kind of things. This was Haryana. We've done many others across the country. And we find there are amazing facilitators, but then when they write English, you get nothing. I mean, even now the English that we do look at, the grammar is really iffy. But then wherever we do have a little bit of we don't understand it, we do go back to them and say, what exactly did you mean? And they go back to their notes, which is in local language. Yes, so mainly we look at that. People who can facilitate, who are good communicators, and in this case, those who can connect to children at their level.
We tried to get people who had some experience working with children before. That was one of the criteria we used, but it wasn't always, a good facilitator wasn't always a person who had worked with children. So it was kind of trying to balance those two criteria.
Just a follow-up. More than that, I'm guessing that it was really important that women work with
Oh, yes,
boys.
Yeah.
boys. That absolutely. So we had a group of girls who were going to girls, 2 girls, with the girls, 1 and the boys.
So there were 2 women and 2 male facilitators, and the girls group was facilitated by the woman facilitator, and the boys group by the men.
Yeah, hi, I'm from Hand in Hand India. My question is, it's a very interesting presentation, and all the tools are very specific and would have their pluses and limitations. So, like for instance, polling, the measure would involve a sense of confidentiality because it deals with, slightly specific issues, and your measure of PRA and Venn diagram would be more, which would involve relativity and comparison. So, how do you choose which study would suit, which method? And can you also interchange? I'm interested in, for instance, if you were to study domestic violence, could you choose the Venn diagram or the PRA? Or you feel that the polling measure was the best? And how do you choose which method for which study?
On the domestic violence one specifically, one of the issues, this project has been going on for a while, and Breakthrough had implemented it earlier as well, and we came in the current phase of the project. So they already had an experience of trying to collect data on domestic violence, and there were issues of social desirability bias there. It wasn't very easy to ask one-on-one whether somebody has faced any of these incidents. And so that is why we felt that the polling booth would suit this particular study. It was a tool, like I mentioned, we developed in 2002 and 3, and I think that it was used for work on HIV/AIDS and in that context. So that again, it's a very sensitive information related to sexual behavior and practices. And so that tool we've used in similar contexts, but there's no reason why the tools couldn't be combined if it's required for a study. If you wanted something where you also want the community response to a particular situation, the PRI technique could be used. It wasn't used in this case because we weren't really looking at that, but
can you choose, for instance, the polling method along with the PRA technique if you were to have a sense of comparison?
Yeah, I think we could, because we have used the polling booth along with FGDs before. I don't know if you want to add any input.
The thing is that it's not, the comparisons is, the polling booth is very clear. It just gives you a methodology where you can ask very direct questions on things which you feel that if I spoke to the same person face to face, they will not answer. So the response is also just a yes or a no. It can be done with women or communities where their literacy levels are very low or even zero. So we're not really asking anymore. We've done that in things where we, in HIV studies where we look at sex and sexuality. We've done it when we were studying the effects of left-wing extremism in Jharkhand and in some of those areas where people don't want to talk about safety and security.
It's very simple. Do you have a technique to think of which technique to apply to which study?
Oh yes, of course. It depends on what you want out of the study, and that's all. Yes, but we don't combine polling booth with others in terms of analysis.
You have a technique to think of which technique to apply to what study,
yes.
And what would that technique be?
It would depend on the objectives. It would also depend upon the time frames and I guess sometimes the budget envelope also. So.
Yeah. For example, I mean, the study with children, and this is one example, but we're doing more currently with children, and where we're trying to use similar tools. So that becomes one of the criteria is if the target group is such where you need this kind of interaction, then you would design the tools accordingly. And as opposed to maybe if you're working with an adult group, we may not use the same methods, and it might be a more traditional focus group discussion.
We'll take one more question.
Hi, I'm from Oxford Policy Management, and I wanted to ask a question about the body mapping technique. So what was the age group of children that you looked at, and did you face problems relating to comprehension of sensitive issues and whether they were able to understand, and did you get like proper discussions? Because according to your presentation, there was a lot of discussion that happened. So.
Wait, I think one of them should answer actually about that question.
I think I'll take that since I was in the field. Yeah, I don't think comprehension was an issue because you break it down for the children, right? So the body map functions in the sense that you ask them, these are the legs, what are the things that you do with your legs? And then what are the things that girls can't do, girls can do, boys can do, can't do. So it's sort of also the kind of responses that come up also tends to give you an idea about what they value, what they perceive. And so you're not feeding anything to them. So it gives you an idea about sort of what they value as what they notice while in their own entire socialization process. So that you get that as well as, you know, a generic idea about like what are the differences and stuff. So I don't think there is a comprehension problem per se for them to understand. Age group was children from class 6th and 7th. So
it's the same age group as covered by the study that Tarun spoke about.
Do you also follow up with probing questions? One is what do they associate with? The other is why do they think so, or why are they saying so?
Yeah, so you can't ask leading questions which sort of like give you the kind of like,
No, based on their answers.
Based on their answers, yeah, you have to probe a little because they can say for something as good as fashion is good. That's a common response that came up. But what do you mean by good? Why is it good? So you have to follow it up so that you can get a better idea of what they mean by that term, something as generic as good.
Okay, thank you very much. Next we have Dr. Charity Troyer-Moore, and she will be speaking on her experiences in Madhya Pradesh.
So first I'd like to thank Clear and the community evaluators and UN Women and the others that were involved in this event. It's very interesting to hear about other people's studies, and hopefully you'll find the one that I'm talking about interesting as well. So it's my talk today will talk about the kind of the nitty-gritty of measuring female empowerment in Madhya Pradesh. And I know you probably have some ideas about what the outcomes would be in the state itself, but just to kind of highlight, the male literacy rate in Madhya Pradesh is 1/3 of the males, and then the female literacy rate is 50%. So even though in a state with poor outcomes, the outcomes for women are much worse. And I've got listed there are 4 study districts as well, so you can see that there are actually some large differences between male and female outcomes across the districts. And then of course sex ratios as well are poor in Madhya Pradesh and go down as low as 83.4 in rural areas of one of our districts that we're working in. So these numbers just highlight the challenge of and the importance of measuring female empowerment in the area. And the conservative nature of our study is kind of highlighted by this picture here of a woman who was sitting by a baby, rocking, and just, she's covering her face with the veil. And so I thought it was interesting, the comment about women perceiving empowerment is how they look at the sarpanch. So, because when we go into these villages, the women almost immediately cover up, especially if there are males in our group. So in some ways, this concern with covering their faces in the presence of males or other outsiders is kind of an appropriate metaphor that for the difficulty of actually getting kind of behind the veil as researchers to understand the dynamics of female empowerment in like such a conservative area. So let me just begin and give you a little bit of context about our research study. The government of Madhya Pradesh initiated a program to increase financial access for individuals who live in areas that are relatively unconnected from the formal financial system. And they unveiled this ambitious plan of covering all these households in these designated shadow areas that really didn't have access to formal banks. So to reach the households, they began working with major banks in the area to create ultra-small banks. And here's a picture of one right here. And they are managed by business correspondents that have the power to conduct withdrawals and deposits for account holders. So these bank USBs, they have high levels of transparency and controls against corruption by using fingerprint reading devices and smart cards, just depending on the bank responsible for it. So here's an example from the Central Bank of India. It's just a small room in the panchayat. And here's the fingerprint scanner, smart card, and you can conduct transactions and just get a small receipt from that. So prior to opening these ultra-small banks, the government also undertook an extensive censusing activity to track all the households in the state and then link their demographic information to their current status as recipients and government benefits. So the plan now is to open a bank account in the name of every identified eligible person who has no account in his or her own name at the ultra-small banks where relevant, and then to pay all government benefits directly into these individual accounts. So this is ambitious in a lot of different regards, especially with respect to infrastructure, operations, support from the banks, but actually will have a significant impact on women in the state in particular. So prior to initiating this MP model of financial inclusion, which is what they call it, or Samruddhi, which I hope I'm saying the Hindi correctly, prosperity, right? It was typical for the government to pay benefits of various types into one household account, which is usually managed by the male head of the household. So by opening an account for every single beneficiary in the state and establishing a system by which it's difficult for other community or family members to actually access that account without the help of the account owner, the government's actually opening accounts primarily for women within the state. So knowing the government's interest both in the new policy and understanding how it affected household outcomes, our studies investigators began working with the government to design an evaluation of this policy, particularly since it's focused almost primarily on women. And so we decided we wanted to look at how this actually impacts female empowerment in the state. So just to kind of give you a little bit more context, this is kind of a research policy partnership between the government of Madhya Pradesh and then economists from Dartmouth, Duke University, Harvard University, and MIT in the United States. And we've been working with the government of Madhya Pradesh's Panchayati Raj and Rural Development Department. So the researchers have recognized, I guess I should back up and say I'm actually just the research manager for the project, but I'm very involved with all the activities that we've been doing on the ground and kind of the academic side as well. But we recognize that this plan of the government of Madhya Pradesh obviously could have significant impacts on females' well-being, but it wasn't immediately clear that all of these would be positive impacts actually, at least in the short term. And this line of reasoning is backed up by research. So in a study that was completed not too long ago by one of the principal investigators for this study, Dr. Rohini Pandey of Harvard's Kennedy School, along with several other researchers, they examined risk factors associated with spousal violence in slum areas of Bangalore. And they found actually that women who participated in vocational training and formal social groups, which we would maybe associate in our minds with female empowerment, were actually at increased risk of suffering spousal abuse in the previous 6 months. So those results are purely observational. They can't be considered causal in any way, but they do highlight the possibility that women who participate in activities that maybe run against social norms within their communities in these activities would actually increase female empowerment. They could actually have some sort of negative backlash towards this increase in empowerment and autonomy. So we thought that was an important thing to capture, but also ideally to track over a longer period of time to understand how those dynamics change over time if there were some sort of backlash. And just kind of a quote regarding this, there's a later study by one of the people who worked on this Bangalore study, Krishnan, and some others, says that our research revealed basically that a woman's conformity to family and community norms and expectations can serve to protect her from domestic violence, while defiance of or an inability to conform to social norms is liable to increase her domestic violence risk. So there's the potential that interventions that run against these traditional social norms and values may actually have, lower or actually result in kind of lowering, in a sense, female well-being, at least for a time. So to understand the impact of the change in Madhya Pradesh of these bank accounts on the women themselves, we began working with our government partner in the middle of 2013 to implement and also to evaluate this policy as it unfolds in the 4 northern districts that were listed on the first couple of slides. So these areas were selected in part due to their relatively poor female-specific outcomes. So they're a very relevant place, obviously, to try to measure female empowerment. And the study actually is not complete yet, so we're very much a work in progress, and we're yet to collect our main data on female empowerment and female well-being. So I think I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to just kind of discuss what we've done up to this point in the project, and then also what we have planned as far as measuring female empowerment. And I appreciate any comments or questions, and that'll help guide us as well. So first, what are the details of the project itself? So the study is a randomized control trial, which Taryn was talking a little about, and I think most of us understand well. The idea is that certain randomly selected units, in this case we're randomizing panchayats, are monitored, but they don't benefit from inclusion in the program or policy change. They're kind of a status quo area, while the other randomly selected units belong to treatment groups that benefit from the program or policy change. So obviously by randomly selecting which panchayats are included in these different areas, we'll minimize the possibility that the evaluation results are driven by characteristics of the panchayat that might systematically vary with how they're included in the program. So in our study, we're actually evaluating 2 different levels of the government's program. So there are actually 2 mutually exclusive treatment arms in the study. So of the 199 panchayats that are included in the study area, approximately 1/3 have no specific intervention implemented. So this would be our status quo area. And our initial work suggests that the vast majority of the time, these status quo areas, in these places, women's NREGA wages, which is what we're focusing on in particular, is the NREGA payments made into the household, are paid into a household jointly held account. So then in another randomly selected 1/3 of the panchayats, this is treatment arm 1, the eligible women are invited to participate in an official bank account opening camp. And then in the final group, they're invited to open bank accounts, and then also their NREGA wages will actually be physically linked, or I should say through online, will be linked to the woman's specific NREGA job card, so that all of her wage payments for the work that she completes on any of these public works projects will be paid into an individual account rather than into this the typical joint household account or an account specifically in her husband's name. So we've been working the study district since August of 2013 to determine the level of NREGA activity in the study panchayats, the functionality of the banks that are working in the study area, and to identify households that are eligible. So just kind of for your information, these households to be eligible have to contain a married couple wherein either the husband or the wife have worked for NREGA, and in which the wife doesn't have a bank account in her own name at this point in time. So here's just kind of a slide of some of the someone actually conducting an interview. So from late November until now, we've been conducting a census, actually, of all potentially eligible households as we identified them in the NREGA management information system. And so eligible women are identified in the course just of a 10 to 15 minute survey, asking them and other household members about their marital status, their experience working for NREGA, and bank account ownership. So then these women are invited to the camps, and just to kind of show you a few pictures, here's an example of women waiting in line for camps to open up their accounts, and here are some women also waiting for their accounts to be opened. And then in addition to that, our qualitative scoping in the field has just really highlighted major issues that could preclude women's effective use of these new bank accounts. So some of the women in the study areas just really don't understand the value of bank accounts or savings or investments, or they believe they don't have any money to save. Many are confused about how to use the accounts, and they're actually intimidated by the thought of withdrawing money from the account. So furthermore, there's often a general distrust kind of these ultra small banks and the people that work with them, because they don't seem like actual bank officials to the people in the communities. So to address this problem and to understand kind of the additional impact of providing training on financial literacy in the study area, we're overlaying an additional treatment regime of financial literacy training in 67 of randomly selected panchayats that were in treatment arms 1 and 2. I think that this part of the study is actually very important, because if we're trying to reach out to women and help them and give them bank accounts and so on and give them greater control of household resources, they really need to understand how they actually can access their accounts and use them. So that will be rolling out in March, and then beyond that we're going to continue on into the survey that we'll be doing and follow-up studies. So now we kind of arrive at the crux of the question posed here today. How do we actually measure female empowerment? So I'll begin kind of by outlining our plans to gather information for what we'll do, and then I want to discuss a little bit of the practical challenges as well, because we've run into a lot already through our time spent in the field in Madhya Pradesh. So after all these bank accounts are opened and they're linked to the NREGA wage payments where it's relevant, and all this financial literacy training has been conducted, we do plan to conduct a follow-up survey, as I said, of households in control and treatment areas to understand how females' sense of empowerment, autonomy, and so on changes as a result of opening these bank accounts and these women gaining greater control of these resources. So depending on the availability of funding and timelines and so on, it would be excellent for us to be able to do kind of a medium-term follow-up as well, so that we can see what type of changes do occur over time. So at the outset, we just want to understand exactly what it is we're trying to measure. Obviously, female empowerment's really multifaceted. It's difficult to succinctly define, but we say it's basically a woman's sense of autonomy with respect to her rights, her resources, and her voice. So obviously, capturing proxies for this are much easier than just talking to someone directly about empowerment. But we do think it also covers a lot of different spheres: economic, political, social, that sort of thing, and we're trying to capture a lot of those in this survey. So since the intervention itself is focused on the financial sector, we're going to evaluate the program's impact on financial and economic outcomes. We're going to do this by separately asking male household heads and their wives a battery of questions related to activities that they conduct in the formal and in the informal banking sector. So to understand this, we'll also directly ask female respondents about how they use their bank accounts, the frequency with which they were used, and so on. If the accounts weren't used, we'll probe to understand what kept them from being used. And we may also ask respondents on their knowledge of how they can use their accounts and financial literacy, that sort of thing. And the reason that we're actually doing that is because we need to understand how well the policy worked before we can say, I mean, if we find that there's no change in female sense of empowerment, we need to be able to know if that's because the program itself wasn't working correctly. And so we need to ask those types of questions for that very reason. So we'll also ask about their knowledge of their NREGA payments and so on. Did they know they were actually getting wages paid to them into these accounts and so on? So next, another piece, we actually haven't talked about this in any of the other studies today, is studies have supported the idea, and I think it's very well known, that greater control of resources in a household by a woman and potential resources in the household can increase the woman's relative power in the marriage relationship. And we've also known through research that basically male and female preferences do tend to diverge, with females generally preferring to spend a relatively larger proportion of their income on children's health and related items and nutrition, perhaps, than men would. So there's variation in this in study results, but we would expect that if a woman is gaining not only control of financial resources in the household, but also relative inter-household bargaining power, that there may be a shift both in the absolute level of expenditures on how things are spent in the household, and also then in relative proportions of items that are spent in the household. So maybe a larger proportion will go to health or something that would benefit the children more if the woman had not just a greater control of resources, but also greater household bargaining power. So we'll be asking questions about recent expenditures in this follow-up survey, and as far as time frame and so on, recall periods, I think that's something that we'll be testing in the field, and before we decide for sure exactly how we're going to do that. So that said, those are very important issues that might relate to female empowerment, but they obviously can't summarize it all. So there's much more beyond economic
questions that are important. So one piece of empowerment that's also important is just knowledge in the household. So we're looking at the quality of intra-household information and what females know about other household members, and particularly financial expenditures and activities in the household. So we want to understand if the wife is more knowledgeable now about households and spending. And just to kind of go through quickly so I can get to the practical issues before I run out of time, we want to talk and also ask women about mental well-being, and so we'll be asking questions regarding stress levels, depressive indicators, and there, we don't have a survey fully drafted at this point, but there are definitely good batteries of questions that have been tested in low-income, resource-constrained settings that we would probably start from. So in this case, there's a Center for Epidemiologic Studies depression scale that we would probably start from to start iterating to understand what type of questions to be asking. So we'll also ask questions about women's perceptions of autonomy. So we would ask very specific questions related to this, such as, could you visit, your GP head? Could you visit your district capital? Could you go shopping in your village to another store without any sort of prior permission by anyone in your household? And who would you need approval from if you needed approval? Another type of question is, if you were to experience a specific type of emergency in your household and you immediately needed money, what would be the various things that you could do to get money? And we would ask this not just of women, but also of men, to understand the differences in what it is that people can actually do within their household. So we might have some more questions related to perceptions of gender roles and privileges and rights and responsibilities as males and females. So then also we hope to be looking at violence against women, as we're concerned that this is an issue that might come up as females get greater control of household resources. So this is obviously a very sensitive subject, and we'll have to develop and test this very carefully. And one thing we've talked about so far is maybe potentially just asking women and males about the perceptions of spousal abuse or domestic abuse within the village, so kind of related to both the prevalence and also the permissibility. So we would say, like, in a specific case, maybe it's, if a wife fails to cook dinner in time, is it permissible for her to be slapped? Something like that. And, like I said, we'll be testing these very thoroughly. And then if we do ask any questions about recent experiences of abuse, this would only ever be asked of women, and they would, of course, be ensured that everything that they said was kept confidential. So then, finally, we're going to ask about aspirations related to children. So we want to understand if women's greater control of the resources makes them change, maybe because they control more money, that they would hope that maybe their daughters or their sons would go to school longer, that sort of thing. And also if it just changes kind of their expectations related to their children. So how much education do you expect or hope for your male and your female children to complete? And what type of activities do you hope for and kind of aspire for your children, males and also females? Okay, so now I think it's always interesting to put this on paper, and then when you actually go to try to do these things, it's much more difficult in the actual context of how you're trying to actually implement the research. So we need to talk about dealing with practical challenges to measuring female empowerment. So even entering the villages that we go into without our faces covered and using female surveyors who work outside the home is something that really challenges the status quo in our survey areas. So I think we have to walk a fine line of kind of respecting the context, but yet also, going in and getting the type of information that we want and need. But so first of all, we just need to make sure, obviously, that appropriate systems are in place. We need to sensitize the surveyors very well as far as the types of topics that we'll be talking about, the context of the villages that we're working in. They already have a lot of good experience with that, so they understand how they work well. But I mean, this involves regular training, not just at the outset, but also refresher training, and surveyors practicing surveys with each other, surveyors conducting surveys and doing piloting in non-sample areas, this sort of thing. We would be testing surveys in these non-sample areas and then debriefing with respondents. And then, of course, in the surveys, we need to include really appropriate introductory and transition text so that we can help, in some ways, just build rapport between the surveyor and the person that's being surveyed with respect to these really sensitive subjects. And then there's what we like to do in our surveys is we actually collect data on smartphones, and then we have the capability to audio monitor every single survey. So this not only helps us understand the quality of the data that's being collected, and we can verify, the software entry versus what we actually hear when we scrutinize the survey, but we can also listen to the tones that the surveyors take and the rapport that they build with the people that they're talking to. So it helps us understand if, surveyors need some additional coaching and that sort of thing to increase their effectiveness. So all these things are very typical steps of data quality collection, so I'm not going to go into that more. Obviously, community buy-in is a very important thing as well, and we've worked very hard to get crucial letters of support from government partners, from bank partners, and so on, so that when we go into communities, we get the okay of the Sarpanch almost immediately to go ahead and work in these communities. And obviously, we've been working to open these bank accounts and to continually go back, and we're conducting various activities in the communities, which really helps build rapport over time, and I think will be a really we'll find that it have been very beneficial for us having done that when we go back and try to conduct these surveys later on. So one major challenge though that we have with conducting surveys of women, especially on these sensitive topics, I don't know if this picture here is of someone from our team just kind of piloting a survey. I don't know if it looks problematic to you, but to me it's like a huge red flag, because there's one person serving, there's this woman in the pink, down with the pink and the black and the white, and she's trying to answer, and there are about 20 people gathered around. So this is very problematic. So one challenge we've really had is being able to speak privately with females in these very conservative areas. So we kind of have a strategy that we've done. We take, first of all, male and female surveyor pairs, and because we're asking women-sensitive questions, part of the reason, sorry, gotta speak into the mic more. Part of the reason, obviously we want to collect information from males on what they think about, females' rights and responsibilities, all that type of thing. But part of the reason we also want to survey males is to kind of distract them from the fact that we're talking to the women in the household. So we take a male and a female surveyor, and they go and try to split the husband and wife up and then survey individually. We also have extra field staff to kind of start drawing the crowds away, because even if you have a male and female separated, there's lots of other people that try to gather around, particularly community leaders or, the uncle or the cousin of the Sarpanch and so on. So we need to usually try to keep them away as well. We also have found it's been very effective to warn that, we're asking female-specific questions, and that tends to make men kind of shy away, and they just want to go off in a group with men. And then also we need to train our surveyors just very extensively on the survey protocol. And for this follow-up survey, we're going to have a very strict rule that these questions cannot be asked in the presence of any other adult. So if someone else comes, the survey just needs to be paused until a certain time that they could, actually continue it. And then one final very practical challenge we faced with measuring and collecting data here in these remote areas is actually recruiting qualified female surveyors. So initially when we were trying to get a large team on board for the project, we found we actually had to go outside of Madhya Pradesh and recruit females from other areas. Now as time has gone on, we've been able to slowly gather support, and one way or to recruit these female surveyors from Madhya Pradesh itself, and one way we've been able to do that is recruiting groups of women who know each other already and feel more comfortable working together, because these women, they're often in very remote locations. They're actually going with male surveyors typically on the back of a bike, so they just feel more comfortable if they know other people that are going in their group. Obviously there's a lot of cohesiveness that's built over time, but it's still something that we like to keep in mind. We've also discussed, we actually haven't had to do this to this point, but having cars and also specialized housing for the women, because they can't really travel and live in places by themselves, in some of these remote areas, and they do have to stay overnight a lot of times. So if we know that we're going to be staying someplace for a significant period of time, we would provide female housing for them so they don't have to worry about that on their own. Anyway, so those are just some of the practical challenges that we've had to face so far. And yeah, I think my time's already up, so I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you, and I'm open to questions, and I appreciate any comments too, because like I said, this is still just being developed on our part, so thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions.
Thanks, Charity, for that. Just wondering, have you, in your findings, did you find any of those women to be financially independent? They have NREGA and all that, so I'm sure there is one.
So we really haven't done any quantitative work on that at this point. I will say that in some of our qualitative work, I just know going to some villages that there was at least one woman I met who seemed, I wouldn't say she was financially independent, but she was very savvy as compared to others. But for the most part, a lot of the women are just very dependent on their husbands and really know nothing about the finances in the household, or they just kind of seem like they tend to defer more to the husband.
Because I was more interested to really know if a woman is financially independent, still there is chance of domestic violence. You know. So
Yeah, no,
those
that's,
correlation could be
yeah,
very
no, that's
interesting.
definitely something we'll be looking at. So.
Yeah, I have a question. So, is the objective of your research only for the government-sponsored, NREGA and the ultra-small branches, or you want to just understand women's empowerment and financial inclusion? Because there are a lot of NGOs and microfinance organizations who do a lot of work in the area of financial inclusion, including training women in financial literacy, capacity building. So you would have a lot of these indicators where you would have a change in women's, levels of perceptions and empowerment in organizations which work for, women's financial inclusion and capacity building. So you're not interested in that at all?
No, it's not that we're not interested in it, but yeah, primarily the study grew out of the government saying, like, basically we're going to roll all this out, and it was basically this, the researchers said, hold up, let's at least see what this is actually going to do. So.
My name is Renuka Mutihar. I wanted to ask you that the financial inclusion, the program that is there for women to access these small banks, that are you able to find out that are these women across castes? What kind of groups are they from? Are they from really social disadvantaged groups? Have you been able to assess that?
So just qualitatively, they're typically Adivasi women, and then in 2 of our districts, they're from the Saharia tribe. So we do have a unique group in our study, actually, but we'll do more in that in the follow-up survey to actually understand, because we actually don't have a baseline that we conducted besides looking at administrative data and then just a very short household census. But we didn't collect like baseline empowerment or kind of those characteristics. We do know they're SC or ST in the household, but that's it. Age, yeah, we would have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are so many dimensions to the empowerment. There's the financial inclusion, there's the intra-household kind of lived experiences of women with regard to violence, permissions, etc. How are you going to stitch this together in terms of the weights you give to different things? Because I could imagine someone maybe beginning to think of expenditure, but asking permission from her husband to go out, or her mother-in-law. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's a little complex of what judgment calls are you going to make? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we're not looking ultimately to aggregate it in some sort of empowerment index and say, oh, female empowerment went up or went down as a result of this. I think we're planning to keep it in these categories because it is a complex issue. So we can say, maybe they felt greater autonomy with respect to using household resources, but we saw, a slight uptick in domestic violence. It's something that the government needs to be aware of, that when they're instituting a program like this, that this is a possibility that this would happen. Are there strategies to mitigate that risk? So I think that we look at it kind of as these various facets, and we wouldn't try to lump it all together and present it as some sort of one policy recommendation out of it. So.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, just curious to know, in capturing the empowerment of women, are you also capturing the perception of men in those villages?
Yeah, exactly. So that's part of the reason that we're asking males as well as women about that. So for as much as possible, when there's a way to ask about perceptions of women in particular, we would ask the same thing, women perceiving, domestic violence, say, versus male perceptions of domestic violence, or could your wife go, in this case of an emergency, what could your wife do without permission, and triangulate that with, what she's saying and what other community members are saying to understand kind of a little bit more of the depth associated with it.
Hi, I'm Radhika from the Public Health Foundation of India. You had mentioned about the financial training program that was there for the women, and you told them about the banks and the MG NREGA. I wanted to know how were they trained? Who were the trainers who trained them? Mm-hmm. And also, was there any male involvement in a way that were they also told about them? What were their attitudes towards this program? Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we're actually just planning right now, and we'll start rolling it out in March. And the trainers of the program, it's a mix of male and females actually, but it's primarily females that will come to the meetings. So we don't really know yet. I'm curious to find out too, kind of what the reaction to it is. So.
Thank you very much. Now we'll open it up to remarks by Catherine Hay.
You want me to come up or?
You can come up or sit, whatever you're more comfortable with.
I'll just come up for a second.
Okay.
Thanks first to the panelists. We've lost one of them, Tarun. Oh, okay. It was a really fascinating set of presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I wish that each presenter could have had a lot more time to go into more detail, so I know I'll be following up certainly with the different presenters. I'm really glad that that Charity talked about the first part, defining and measuring empowerment, because at a certain point in the presentations, you know, one might have been forgiven if one had begun to get a sense that it was just a rather technical exercise, you know, trying to become more precise about how do we measure empowerment, when in fact, which, you know, depoliticizes the very act of trying to use evaluation to address inequalities. And because, of course, the programs that we're working on are shaped by discourse and dominant discourse and mainstream ideas around gender. So it's not as though, you know, we have people developing programs who live in a completely equitable world, a world of social justice. You know, they live in our world, and they're shaped by our world, and the kinds of ideas that they have for policies and programs are shaped by those inequities. And so, you know, mainstream evaluation or evaluation can just uphold those inequities and can sort of not put a mirror to them and not challenge them, or it can challenge them. And challenging them isn't easy, and challenging them requires taking a stance and applying the tools that you have at your disposal to making those challenges. And in the case of evaluators and researchers, I mean, the tools that we have are methods and instruments and rigor. And so I found it fascinating here to have both of those elements discussed. And I think when we heard Charity describing what empowerment was in the context of her work, but I mean, I think it was a definition of empowerment that many of us could probably relate to, or certainly, I mean, we may amplify or look at sort of different elements, but it was, I think, important to start with that. Tarun, I think, also picked this up in one of his first comments, which I really appreciated, where he mentioned that despite all evidence that gender norms and identities were not amenable to shifting through cash transfers, so we have no evidence, very little, certainly sex ratios has demonstrated that using economic levers can affect gender norms. They continue to be one of our most routinely used policy instruments for doing so. And so here you have, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, we persist. And why is that? Because there's, of course, a very mainstream dominant development discourse that says that we are all economically rational creatures, and we must certainly respond to in an economically rational way. So despite, even when you have evidence that in the context of gender and inequities, that doesn't seem to be the case, we persist in the face of evidence to the contrary. So I'm not suggesting that it can't work in any cases, but I'm just reflecting that, you know, we seem to try and persist even when we have evidence that it doesn't work. So I was really glad that you flagged that, because for me, this is also a space where, as evaluators and as researchers, we can raise these questions of what is empowerment, and do the kinds of policies and programs that we have, are they likely to work? So that's at one level. So what we heard a lot about today was, in the context of a particular project, defining empowerment in a certain way, how can we get better measures to understand if those changes are happening? That's a different level of questioning. But what I'm saying is, and I think what we heard today, is that you can wear both hats. So you can both evaluate in a particular program whether women are becoming more less financially vulnerable, while at the same time also using that to look at broader questions and also ask, but at what cost? You know, is their well-being actually improving, or are we setting empowerment in too narrow a construct? So I thought that it was a really interesting mix of presentations from that regard. It also reminded me of a book that I sort of reread recently by Devaki Jain and Diane Elson called Harvesting Feminist Knowledge for Public Policy. It's a book that came out in 2011. And one of the things, I'm just going to quote Devaki Jain, who many of you would know as a sort of eminent feminist economist who really transformed economics and brought a feminist lens to economics, which I would argue that many of the people in this room are trying to do for evaluation. And one of the things that they said in that book was, essentially what they're talking about in that book and they're flagging is that evaluations can test whether policies and programs work on the ground and for whom, but they can also raise questions around mainstream development discourse and the way this discourse is articulated in policies and programs. And what they say in their book is, and I quote, "The very approach being taken to understanding and measuring progress and planning for and evaluating development needs rethinking." And so I think it's interesting, and I try in my work to think about, where do I have opportunities within particular pieces of work, but then also looking across evaluations to try and look at some of these broader questions around how is it that our development policies and programs frame empowerment? And so do these projects and these efforts and these policies, are they actually moving us in a direction we want? Or are we looking at sort of progress within a fairly narrow paradigm of social inequality that itself we need to question? So are we looking at, so in the example of Tarun's presentation, so, overall, if you have a very discriminatory environment, but attitudes shift slightly, are we basically looking at incremental change within an overwhelmingly inequitable system? Or are we actually trying to also challenge the nature of that system? Or in Charity's example, do we sort of ultimately agree that sort of capitalism is the dominant development discourse and we agree with that, and thus empowerment is sort of becoming better able to capture the gains from capitalism? And so you can see how at different levels as evaluators, people may not be calling me in to sort of evaluate the capitalist system, but it may be that as I do several evaluations looking at sort of certain elements of a development approach that's funded on economic growth, if I look at gender dimensions and broader notions of well-being, and I see over time that women don't seem to be doing well in these systems, then I might also, wearing a separate hat, sort of raise those questions and concerns or look at them in different ways. So again, it was something I thought that came out. What I really liked about the set of presentations also was that I think applying a feminist lens, or if you're more comfortable with an equity lens to your work, is not a methodologically prescriptive way of working. So there's many approaches in evaluation that say this is how you do it. Step A, B, C. I think an RCT is a great example. There's a way that you do it, otherwise it's not an RCT. But there's other approaches in evaluation that are not methodologically prescriptive. So utilization-focused evaluation, participatory evaluation. And for me, what we saw here is that you can apply an equity lens or a feminist lens using any range of methodologies. There's no one methodology for doing it, and I thought we had a really interesting mix of both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. There was a question at the front here on, well, how do you choose? And I really like that question because in theory, the answer is, well, it depends on the question. It depends on the thing that you're trying to answer. But of course, we know that's not fully the case. So often people's choices around methodologies are driven by many things, not just which is the best suited to answering the question at hand. I work for a funder, so I know that we have preferences, and we impose is maybe the wrong word, but we, like to share our ideas on which is the most rigorous method. And so sometimes the methods you choose are affected by sort of dominant discourses, which again are affected by certain things like disciplinary comfort, etc. But I thought it was the right answer, and I think our job as evaluators is also to keep saying that that's the right answer. And I thought one of the things that came up for me when I was listening to what was described was, some of the methods are really, I think, better and richer at understanding what's going on in a particular context and really understanding the nature of the inequities. So for example, with your example, I thought, Tarun, we had questions like, well, okay, so this just shows gender difference. You know, your data doesn't necessarily tell us anything about whether this is good or bad. I mean, my son would probably also say he should be the one to go to school, whereas my daughter would argue it should be her. So what does that really tell us? Whereas, say, body mapping might give me a lot of rich, nuanced ideas. But if I repeated the body mapping in 2 years versus repeating your test in 2 years, yours may be a lot easier to look at change. Not that the first is impossible, but methodologically it's much more complex. So some methods also are more useful in looking at change, or they're easier. And I would also just pick up that this question of, you know, I think building on what Vanita mentioned, this idea of how do you mix methods well? And for me, you know, that's the sort of methodological frontier. When we get to a point where we can kind of combine some of the quantitative measures that you mentioned with body mapping and looking at changes over time, and be able to understand the extent to which both are related or contributing or can be attributed to policies and programs, and not just one program, because in the end it's never about any one donor's or government project or program, but it's rather the mix of things that are going on the ground. Then we're going to be getting somewhere really fascinating. And the last thing I'll just say is, well, 2 quick points. On how do you choose, it also depends. How you choose depends on a couple of things. Who's going to be using it and to do what? I mean, at the end of the day, if nobody's using this information to try and address gender inequities, then why are we doing it in the first place? So I'm definitely one who believes that you've got to have an engagement plan. You've got to be thinking about the user. And you then also have to be thinking about what kind of evidence do they find convincing. If I find body mapping hugely convincing, but I'm trying to convince the National Rural Health Mission and they don't find that so convincing, I mean, that has to factor in, because ultimately, you know, I would like my data to be used. So that also becomes a factor. And then the other point though is rigor. And again, recognizing that rigor comes, if you're talking about body mapping, the ideas around rigor that where body mapping would get its rigor is different from where an RCT would get its rigor. They come out of different epistemological traditions. And so if you're working on more qualitative approaches, don't make the mistake of trying to get your rigor from quantitative methods. So get your rigor from more qualitative, naturalistic approaches. And Lincoln and Guba are some of the leads in evaluation who have done that kind of work. And the final thing I just want to pick up is this question on trajectories that, again, Charity flagged. So, I mean, we don't really have good trajectories around empowerment. So it's one thing to sort of say, what is empowerment, and how do you measure it? But it's another thing to actually have some idea of how do you get from point A to point B, and what does that trajectory look like? Charity mentioned Rohini Pandey's work that looked at sort of unintended consequences and violence. But I think Michael Woolcock has also done just really interesting work generally on trajectories. So do we think that, you know, if you start talking to children about attitudes, that their behaviors will change, they will be able to influence their partners, that they will then send their daughters to school, right? There's a whole sort of trajectory of thinking behind the programming, but the reality is we just don't have a lot of evidence about how do you actually shift and make more equitable societies. And so I see our work also as building trajectories as we go, but in approaching that, I think we also have to recognize there's so much unknown about these trajectories. In fact, they may not be sort of this constant, they probably aren't this kind of constant linear upward trend, but actually we're going to have to be looking for backlashes and empowerment to be declining. And so thinking about what do we actually anticipate in those trajectories and how are we beginning to build them through our work, I think is also important and interesting, and be a question maybe that I'd put to the panelists, along with the question on who's the user, how did that factor in, and where they see accountability, where they see rigor coming from in their choice of methods. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll open it up to greater questions. Before that, I have a few questions for the presenters, as my role as moderator. So the first question that I wanted to ask the presenters was that we've seen a lot of really great advantages of using these new and targeted tools, specifically tools that are very good for certain contexts. But I think one challenge we face is that it becomes more difficult for us to compare among different studies, particularly if we're using these studies to design policies and programs. So I guess the question I had for them is, how can we achieve this balance of using, these really good, innovative tools, but at the same time being able to compare among studies and actually get some good lessons from these? Yes.
So I think one thing that we'd like to do is work from, and I had kind of mentioned it, batteries of questions that have been well established, by the WHO, maybe for domestic violence, for the Center for Epidemiological Studies, for depression, that sort of thing, and use it as a starting point, and ideally share some core questions across, the two instruments. But we need to go beyond that, of course, and do things that are context specific. But ideally, if we could kind of share some of that to have a starting point. And, we're trying to measure things that are a little bit more objective as well, like expenditures. And I think there are standard ways of doing that allow for better comparison across projects. So that's helpful in that sense. But I think kind of holding on to some of that core that could be compared, as well as, focusing some on the context, can be a useful strategy. Sorry.
Okay, so actually I'd sort of ask why would you want to necessarily say that the only reason to have multiple studies is to compare across studies, right? So, ultimately every study is a snapshot of society, and, it might be a snapshot of a particular intervention as well. And, multiple studies give you a multidimensional look at the same things. Sometimes you can say that, I'm comparing two studies and saying that this is a more correct study versus another one. And other times you say that, look, there are multiple studies that give you different views from a different angle, and society consists of, all those different angles all together all at once. And so as researchers and social scientists, we might, just have to learn to accept the fact that you're going to have multiple studies and they're going to give you a different dimension on the same problem, or, give you a, richer view of the same problem. And that's what you take out of it. I don't know if that necessarily addresses your question, but in some ways, this is I think the process of learning through multiple studies as well. Yeah.
To add on to Tarun's point, I think it also depends upon the issue that you're trying to address. So there might be some issues that are more comparable across different studies and contexts, but there might be some things that are not so comparable, and then you have to weigh the whole. Should it be a study that can then look at gender norms everywhere, or when you're working on a project on gender norms in Haryana, do you really want to be specific to that context, because that issue has its own ramifications and cultural context there? And so is comparing it adding that much more value than what you're doing right now? That has to be weighed as well.
But if I could just add to that as well, I do think we have to think about end users. So, so my case maybe is a little bit different, because we do have a government partner who's an end user, and they're trying to decide, across different policies. So they do need some sort of comparability, in how things shift based on the policy. So I think it really does depend on who you're ultimately doing this for.
Okay. And I have one more question before we open it up to the rest of the audience. So there's been a lot of talk on how it's been very difficult to link attitudes with actual behavior and actions. And this is not unique to gender. It's unique to a lot of, different studies that look at things like discrimination and different types of attitudinal changes. And this is, it's quite difficult, because we often see that, individual actions are heavily shaped by rigid social norms and institutions. So how can we sort of better think about how we can capture the link between attitudes and behavior, specifically in gender? I know this is a very broad question that we really don't have the answer to, but I'd be interested in kind of picking the brains of the presenters.
So I think, before I answer that question, I'd just like to point out that there are a bunch of people in the room who have worked with us on the Haryana project. So there's my collaborator and Devadhar, who's sitting right here, but there's also like Nikki Shrestha and Vrinda Kapoor, who are sitting on my right, and they've done a lot of work. And I'm sure there are other people in the room who have also worked on this project. So if people have questions about this project, they should certainly feel free to ask them as well. It's sort of a first order question for our project, because in some ways what we're trying to do is to find out whether changing attitudes will ultimately change behavior. Now, we might care about attitudes in of themselves, right? So having people just have better views, if there are people in your family who are nicer, or that might lead to people being just happier and have welfare effects in of themselves. But we also care about many other things that we so for example, we care about women being enrolled in schools, we care about like women's marriage market outcomes, all those things we care about. And so my answer to this is that, as you rightly pointed out, it's hugely understudied. Whether or not attitudes will lead to better behavior. Well, we're going to try and answer part of that, right? And hopefully in a few years, we will be able to make conclusive statements. So that's about all that I have to say right now. I feel, that right now we don't have the equipment to be able to conclusively answer that. Perhaps we'll never have it, and as you say, it's always context dependent. But perhaps this is also the start of many more questions or many more studies on this, and not perhaps not only in the area of gender, but in many other contexts as well. Right? So,
actually, we're also doing an impact evaluation currently, which is on early marriage with breakthrough, and that again is trying to answer that question of whether changing attitudes results in changing behavior. And so we are also at the stage where we've just done baseline. So we don't have that answer yet, but that's what we're trying to measure. So that will also take a bit of time till we get there.
I think, there are ways to ask quantitative type questions to address that, like, asking the attitude questions and then also asking maybe about past behaviors or future expected behaviors. But I don't think it gets at it truly all that well. So I think in some ways, some of these more qualitative, very in-depth methods could be effective ways to look at it as well. So.
Yeah, nice to hear from the panelists about the questions that Catherine was asking. So this would be interesting to hear.
Sure, I can repeat the questions if you like. Since I have the mic, I'll also answer your question on knowledge and behaviors. I mean, we have a lot of evaluation work going on right now that's trying to look at connections between knowledge, behaviors, campaigns. It's a complex area to measure because often you're just capturing recall. But I would say measure both, right? So if you also have this, it's again this idea of trajectories, like what's the timeline between attitudes leading to behavior change? What are the other cultural, contextual elements that you would theorize? And I think I haven't heard theory mentioned today, but I think obviously theory underpins all of our work. And so when would you theorize, and in what context would you theorize that people would be able to act on knowledge? And so if you're measuring that and you're looking at those different contexts in which you might expect attitude change to lead to behavior change, and you're measuring behavior change, I mean, that, and you give yourself enough time, which is often what we don't do, but you give yourself enough time. So, for example, I'm also involved in some evaluations where the evaluation extends long beyond the project. And it's because you're trying to build in that ability to look at those questions. But to repeat my questions to the panelists, so I was interested in this question, and Charity sort of responded a little bit on it, but this question of who's the user, and how do you intend to use your findings, and how did the intended user affect your methodological choices? And then in terms of your methodological choices, and again, in Urvashi's example, it wasn't just one project, so she was talking about methods sort of detached from the project, so I let her speak to any one of those. But in terms of your methodological choices, where do you see their rigor residing, right? So you can have your rigor residing in feminist standpoint theory, or being grounded and connected and really being deeply connected. Like if you use an ethnographic approach, your rigor is coming from a different tradition than if your rigor is defined as statistically significant. And so what I was just trying to get at was that it's not that one is more or less rigorous, but they can be equally good or bad, but that you have to assess them based on the traditions out of which they emerged. And so that would be questions I'd be interested in hearing.
So for the study that we did, the end user, it's sort of a complicated situation, but it's essentially breakthrough because they're using the findings from the study to design their tools, which will form the intervention that Tarun and the team in JPAL will evaluate. So they were the end users, and that did, to a large extent, kind of affect the methodology we use, because they wanted a formative research which was qualitative, and we discussed what kind of methods to use with JPAL and with Breakthrough. And in that conversation, we kind of decided that if we're doing this with children, we would need sort of more interactive tools, and that is how this whole body mapping exercise was developed. In terms of where is the rigor, I think a year ago we sort of did this training with our qualitative research advisor, and one of the things that he said was that in qualitative research what you're looking at is managing your subjectivity. So you're kind of getting responses and trying to understand them and analyze them, and you will have your own response and opinions on it. So, but what you're going to try to do is to a large extent, try to document and get as much as possible, and not do that without the interference of your own subjectivity. So that was his sort of definition of bringing in rigor into qualitative research. So I think that only comes in from the kind of training that you have of the investigators who are going in, how prepared they are to address all of these questions and get those interactions out.
So I think you've asked a really interesting question, and we can go on and on about this. And but I'm going to try and offer the short answer, right? In terms of saying that yes, obviously we have multiple tools that we use. They come out of various first limitations. I mean, as well as objectives. They also come out of for example, a simple limitation is that of the researcher's own capabilities, right? So I could not do what Urvashi does, right? Simply because I don't have those skills, and so there are various limitations, there are various objectives, but let me also speak a little bit about audiences, right? So sometimes there is this view that we're trying to speak to one particular user of an evaluation or the information that we've gathered. So in this case, it might be the person who's designing the intervention, or it might be a government that we're speaking to, right, who might then extend the policy, or it might be someone who's funded the evaluation or something like that. But there is also, I think, a broader audience, which is the knowledge base and the priors of people at large, right? So they include researchers. I think researchers are a very important community. But in some ways, it also, what I find particularly important is that we should give people a sense that, look, say you have this attitude change program, right? It's to help everyone break out of this notion that it's only a carrot and stick issue that will change gender norms, right? Gender behavior. So given that there is that possibility, you want to speak to very large audiences, right? So you want to speak to your user, whoever's doing the intervention, you want to speak to the government, you want to speak to academics and the research community within the context of a place like India, but also globally you want to speak to them. But also I think it's very important to emphasize that ultimately our findings are used more broadly, right, and not just within this community, and that's the audience that you ultimately want to speak to, right? You want to change people's true norms about what possible policies could look like, and that's what we are trying to do. And in terms of tools, you bring in the whole mix because you're going to learn different things from different aspects of it. So it's just very important to recognize that many tools are important. And at the same time, you can't always use all the tools simply because you have limitations, either of skills or budget or time or something like that. Yeah.
I think these are interesting questions that you pose too, just because you always have, or at least we always have, multiple end users. So maybe ultimately we're thinking this is a project for the government, but really they're probably not going to change their policy. And so providing results to them is more related to maybe here are additional things you need to think about that might be happening in communities as a result of the policy that you have in place. But there's a broader discourse that it's going to feed into as well. I mean, there are other policies that are, that try to provide the benefits strictly to women here in India. I think the food security bill wants to put the eldest female on the name as the name on the ration card, so on. And then, of course, our donors that we're looking to, satisfy their demands and so on. And then, contributing to this broader knowledge and as a public good in the academic circles and so on. But one piece about that I think is important to think about too is in what we were doing is, you know, it's an RCT, so we think, you know, rigor is implementing an RCT well, it's in getting the right sample and so on, and balanced sample and asking the questions correctly, but it's also in the quality of the intervention and making sure that people understand what it is we are actually evaluating. So in this case, since we're working with a government partner, I mean, we've done a lot of hand-holding to make sure that, you know, we're actually evaluating functional banks. And that's just a part of, you know, what we've had to do to actually evaluate the policy. So that's something to think about when we're thinking about rigor itself as well.
I just want to respond to Catherine's question, the two issues that you raised. I think as all of us working in the field of development, our ultimate users are the beneficiaries, so-called, right? I think that's what you... And then, I mean, if you look at that, the final user of an evaluation, I mean, why are we doing evaluation? I think it's this whole... We should really be questioning the paradigm of evaluation being a client-driven exercise. And which is what I find a little bit troubling about most of the answers that I've heard so far. But we're not. I mean, evaluation in the development field is not a client-driven exercise. It is something that, you know, it's knowledge that we're generating for a program, but in the end, it's really about the people. It's about the people who are participating in the program, right? And so, you know, were these women consulted in the development of the survey questionnaires? Were they even comfortable answering this? And, you know, I think these are the questions that when we're talking about a feminist approach to evaluation, and I mean, I think just an equality-driven approach to evaluation is not just getting the information, but it's also about how we're getting that information. And I think that's why the photograph that you showed was very revealing. Not just because, you know, it goes against what you consider as rigorous data collection, but also because that is the reality of working on women's empowerment. You know, that's what we're dealing with. So I really think that, you know, it's a much deeper question than, you know, when we're talking about the use of the evaluation, we need to really think hard and carefully about how are we involving the end users in something that is catering for them. Catherine, the second point about rigor, you know, I think what my stand on this is that, yes, there is, you know, I don't think there is like a continuum of, you know, less rigorous to more rigorous that goes, that sort of aligns with qualitative to quantitative, right? I mean, it's almost like, it's not like that. But I think what is standard is that there are standards for scientific research that should be applicable across all methods. And it might be different if you come from a different science. But I think almost, I really think that as feminists, you know, we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we try to create a parallel universe. You know, we are working within the social science you know, parameter. It might overlap with others, and in some senses we might be independent. But there are certain standards that I think that, you know, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, mixed, whichever the techniques that we've talked about today, that you know, we should adhere to some of them. And you know, whether we like it or not, there is a mainstream which does consider RCTs as being the gold standard. And more and more donors want that. So we have to, you know, as people who are working on feminist evaluation, we have to really think about, you know, how do we work within that paradigm, and do we want to shift it? If we do want to shift it, in what direction? But we have to be very careful that we are always sort of adhering to those norms that are considered as good research. That's just my sort of contribution.
Can I have a quick response? I'm asking the chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you mentioned that idea around the key users and who are the users. And again, to this point on like influencing discourse and we're affecting knowledge and, you know, the society's interested in what we do. I mean, I wish that were just generally the case, but I would argue that that doesn't happen without some effort, right? We like to think as researchers and evaluator that that are great ideas just diffuse out and are taken up, but we know that that's not what happens, and that the average policymaker is not reading American economic journals, but that's where economists want to get published, whether they're working in India or whether they're working in the US, and that incentives around publishing and where we spend our time and the kind of audiences that we cultivate and who we're speaking to may not necessarily be changing discourse and affecting people's lives. So I think users, you can. So I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but I think as a practice, we need to also get much more serious about what that actually entails. And I know some evaluators, for example, who write weekly columns in lay newspapers and trying to take their findings and translate them to affect that discourse. And so I would argue doing it is important, but doing it well is rarely done. There's not a lot of incentives in our field for that kind of work. And so we need to shift that, and we need to shift the resources and time we put on that for that to happen, though I agree it's important. But on this point of rigor, I wasn't arguing that there's no rigor, that we have to create it, but what I was suggesting is that that there's different traditions of rigor that come out of different scientific disciplines. And so if I'm talking to medical sociologists, they would have different criteria than if you're talking to epidemiologists, for example, about what constitutes rigor. And I thought that some of your points around positionality, for example, are really core to getting at rigor in more ethnographic approaches, but they wouldn't be as important in getting at rigor in, say, econometric approaches. But my point was more that in some spaces they're less developed, less clearly shared. So I think if they're less used to analyze and assess the quality of those approaches. And so just there's certain areas where we need to get more explicit about what is a rigorous evaluation using body mapping and what does that look like. And so that, yes, you begin to develop a kind of consistency and using that and then doing meta-evaluations on those kinds of approaches. And I'm just suggesting that in some spaces it's more developed than others. But I don't disagree that we're aiming for consistency and more rigorous and more agreement on what is good. What does good look like with all of these different approaches?
Can I add something to what Catherine has said? So, one of the things that we did in our study was to look at the textbooks in grades 6th, 7th, and 8th that the students in Haryana schools use, and to look at, what are the discussions about gender and sexuality that are in those textbooks. And, I was shocked when I saw those books because they had changed a lot since the time and when I was in 6th grade, right? So in my time, they were dry as dust, and, there was nothing in there about gender or anything related to that, right? So how did this change happen? Essentially, there was, at some point, someone who decided to change those textbooks, and the way that the people who changed the textbook, worked about it is to consult the scientific literature. Right? So you're absolutely right that of any given researcher or evaluator, their incentives might not be to, speak to a broader audience apart from, perhaps the person who funded their study or their, direct client or the journal that they're supposed to publish in, right? But ultimately, this process of social change is a collective process, right? And I think that it does happen, and we are all better for it. Because it happens through those ways, right? So that's my only response to this issue of incentives. You're right that any individual has certain incentives, but collectively we manage to influence change quite quite dramatically, and it comes out of this process of scientific investigation.
I think too, there's a couple of questions. Like, one is the end user. So the women that we're working with, just speaking about, because I completely agree with your point that we need to be thinking about who we're actually working for. The end user of a study itself is going to be very different than the people that you're working for ultimately on the ground, because you're working for them to produce something that's credible and defensible and that holds up to critique, that can help improve life for them. But that being said, I completely agree that, when you are working with these people one-on-one, there needs to be respect, and there needs to be inquiry into, like the survey questions. Are there things that make you uncomfortable? Okay, then let's think about doing this in a different way that can still help, advance your cause without putting you in, an untoward position. So I think those are some good points.
Yeah, I was trying to grasp with the question that why so many women empowerment programs are mostly with women. Is there any link between how we measure women empowerment and present it? So the very less work on the ground has been with men for women empowerment. Or we are finding much easier to work with women for women empowerment and less with men for women empowerment.
It's been a fascinating discussion, I have to say. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thanks to the presenters and to Catherine for her remarks. And just a couple of broad thoughts that I might want to share. Well, one is that I'm most interested in this question of who's going to use these research findings that we are working so hard towards. And we've had a fair amount of discussion, but I think a related question to that is how are we going to present those findings to whom? You know, I come from the Population Council. I've worked a long time with them and previously with the Ford Foundation. And this was a question I sort of asked myself as I joined many years ago. The Population Council is a research organization, and we do research, mostly community-based research, the kind you're speaking of. My own area is health, however. And, you know, I was quite convinced that if we were going to put in all these resources into research in this country or any other country, I was covering the region actually, then it would really be worthwhile if those research findings were truly used by whoever, you know. And there are really, as you all said, multiple uses for those research findings. The very immediate ones, and then the more, you know, the larger community, etc., and the policy makers and decision makers of all kinds, actually, for programs and policies, etc. And I think that the way you present those results makes a big difference. You got to tailor them to the needs of the audience, the particular audience that you're speaking to. So, as if you're talking to the research audience, then peer-reviewed publication perhaps is the answer, or a book or something. But that, as you said, Catherine, is not going to be read by the policymaker sitting in Madhya Pradesh or in the Nirman Bhavan here or somewhere. So one possible, and different ways, creative ways had to be thought of. And we said, well, you know, if you did share something written, I mean, of course, you need to do both. You need to do the communication level dissemination as well as the written word. But say you were doing the written word, then nothing more than 2 pages max, with lots and lots of pictures and diagrams would be ever read by the health secretary, for example. You know, could be the secretary from whichever. And if you are trying to reach this guy, then maybe you can't do it. I mean, you have to do it certain ways, a mix of ways actually. And if you're trying to reach the people that you spoke of, which I think are very important users in the end, there may be very, very different ways of both articulating the issues, discussing them in fora at the community level, as well as presenting them. And we came up with comics and various such ways. We were doing work on male gender issues, you know, and the issue of gender identity and male dominance and so on in this particular case, one example. And we got the boys in the slum communities to really draw the pictures and to come up with comics that they said they wanted comics, and they wanted comics that could fit into their pockets because it was about sexuality, and so it had to be very private. But I'm just sort of throwing examples of what I've gone through. And the other question that you raised was the question of women. They are the end users, hopefully, and how do we engage with women? I think in all this research, everybody's engaging with women, no doubt, and hopefully with men as well. But as I said, I was working on health. This was in my days in the Ford Foundation. I'm talking ways 20 years ago, at least, or 30. You know, qualitative research was not at all done in those days, and in fact was frowned upon. And those who did quantitative surveys and so on looked down upon people who talked about qualitative research in them days, sadly. And that paradigm had to be shifted and changed. So one way we did this was to do a series of training programs largely with NGOs who worked with communities and with women in particular. And a book that some of you may have seen is called Listening to Women Talk About Their Health Issues and Evidence from India. Came out as a consequence of that, which really documents how we undertook research on very sensitive issues, health-related issues, reproductive tract infections, vaginal discharge, and all those kinds of sexuality-related issues with women in different parts of the country, with very poor women, in fact, rural, tribal, slum women, and how these NGOs, as well as academics, were combined jointly to be trained, because the academics them days didn't do qualitative research also. So the whole process of what is qualitative research and how can we do it at the field level started to come through at that time. And it's very nice to see that now when we talk of qualitative research, we always talk of mixed methods, that quantitative alone is not good enough, but that was a long time ago. But I think listening to women and what are their perceptions of whether it's, in this case, it was health, and what do they think can or cannot be done about it, and how can they access services or not, and then link it with the more formal systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Two questions, one to Dr. Tarun and one to Urvashi. Dr. Tarun, more of an echoing questions from what my other colleagues have talked about. What next? You talked about attitudinal change in the children. So it's a very big structure which you are talking about. But then what happens post that? Post your report. I was just curious to know your plan of action with the report. That is one. Maybe what Madam talked about. Maybe beyond the reporting structure which comes in. You talked about life cycle approach and all that. Maybe going beyond that, some transformative approach of trying to understand the life cycle as a recommendation could be a bigger milestone for the reports to come in, which can be a handy kind of a report for the higher ups to really make use of it, because it's primarily related to the government and they'll really use the findings and some recommendation out of the study which has been done. And Urvashi, actually you're talking about the aggregation part of in the last PDI, the 5-point indicators which you're talking about. I was a little curious to understand you're talking about some aggregation collation at a macro level. It'll be easier for you. But then what I understand is, for me, fashion could be just a formal shirt and pant. For the other woman, it could be kind of a jeans and kind of, let's say the same definition could hold good for, let's say, empowerment also. So how do you really accumulate and aggregate those as a macro level where you can really collate and present it to higher level for some intervention? So I was a little curious to know that.
Actually, we have a lot of stuff planned for what we'd like to do. Diva, do you want to talk about this? So if there's interest in that.
I think these are very interesting questions that we grapple with, both as researchers and as people who work on the policy and capacity building teams at JPAL, in how does research actually influence policy. And I think there are a lot of relevant questions that came up on who are the end users, what are the kinds of language or presentations or the methods of engagement with these different users. And I think this is highly relevant. I'm just thinking through a lot of the work that we've been doing recently on this, and it does go a lot beyond our, sort of beyond just your donor, your intervention partner, your government partner, in not just in the dissemination process, but very much in the formation of the research questions, the identification of the research questions, the policy priorities that inform it. A lot of researchers aren't very good at portraying the amount of work they have done in the past, because academics are focused on their sort of end products and not necessarily, I think the question isn't that it doesn't go in, it's just a question of how you portray the work you have done beforehand. For example, this project, which the ultimate goal is to tackle gender discrimination and sex ratio, has had a long process of inputs from civil society organizations in India, from government partners, whether it be Punjab or Haryana. It's had a lot of inputs from multilaterals such as UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, who are working in this area of sex ratio. There were consultations held with these different organizations, individual meetings to identify policy priorities and policy questions, including with you, with POP Council, when we met about a year ago. So there was a lot of groundwork that took place beforehand that went into the design of the questions. So a lot of what you are seeing today, presented by both Tarun and Urvashi, are based on theories of change, not only from Breakthrough, but also from, incorporating inputs from other experts in the field beyond just the academic and research community. Takes in a lot of civil society and government perspectives. And I think that that's a crucial point to keep in mind as we go further along the project, disseminating in different kinds of methods. JPAL has been for a long time elaborating its policy outreach and its dissemination, and I don't think it's simply just making presentations necessarily or having reports. There's a lot of advocacy that goes on beyond the project if it proves to be effective. Actually identifying some of these solutions and working with partners and other potential partners in operationalizing and scaling up some of those proven solutions. So, there's a whole spectrum of things that can be done, but I just wanted to go over a few of these.
I can talk about two of the questions that were raised. The first one was about women empowerment programs with men. And because I've worked most recently on these, I can speak about them. But the projects that we worked on with Breakthrough, they have that implicit component where they are working with men, because, like, for example, in the project on early marriage, the father is generally the decision maker on when the girl gets married in the household. So you cannot really address that issue without tackling the role of men in the entire marriage, the marriage ceremony and choosing the spouse and all of that. So there are projects that are kind of looking at this, working with men on women's issues and women's empowerment. The second question was about how do you aggregate the livelihood tool that you spoke about. So yes, the measurement of the different capitals is based on the community's perception. So they decide what is of value to them and what is the what is a really good house, or what is a house that's less well off. But ultimately, it's kind of put across a 5-point scale, all of these different capitals. So within the physical asset, if you're looking at the house, it could be, one of the things that came out of this exercise was the number of rooms. So if a house has 5 or more rooms, and they are the most well off, and that becomes the highest point on the scale. And if a house has 0 or 1 room, then it's the lowest point on the scale. And so that scale is what is used to aggregate ultimately, and the indicators entirely come from the community. So the indicators might be different, but we're sort of measuring the perception of progress in that community. So it's to scale.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
My name is Minnie. I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to share a concern being in the evaluation business, as I say. I just wanted to connect to the highlights of this whole discussion about the rigor, about methods, about defining what we are going to evaluate. And I'm quite concerned with the way evaluation is placed in the whole project management cycle, even if I break evaluation down to a project component. Planning for evaluation, when is it positioned? Where do we place rigor when you have like a 2 months time in a 6-district project with 35 stakeholders? You want to do mixed method, you want to have a certain number to be covered through quantitative, you also want to have qualitative. So my concern is that as an evaluation community, we perhaps need to reflect more and speak more about how to manage the evaluations, and how it is not ethical to not give proper time, to give a chance to researchers and evaluators to bring any kind of research element, any kind of rigor to the whole process. You still have a luxury in baselines because there's not a deadline pressures. But in evaluations, I'm eventually finding a lot of TORs that actually make no sense. I mean, they will have 8 weeks, 12 weeks is the standard time for a 5-year-old project. and I wonder what they have been doing all these months. So I think that there are reflections needed on that, because I personally feel it is unethical not to give time and still expect rigors, expect something. One is that. The other thing that I also wanted to say that in terms of, particularly in terms of when we are doing these kind of programs, where there's a lot of subjectivity in the crux itself. It's not something that I can measure and say, okay, these many number of children immunized, so program successful. It is not that simple. So I think there has to be there has to be certain separate guidelines or to inform about how to go about evaluating empowerment programs. How do program managers plan for it? And I think because there are, you all are great people and you are so much connected, I would like to perhaps read more on networking sites, what you people have to say about planning it, making it more practically possible for people to put in research and rigor, make it a knowledge product actually, and not just a activity.
Okay, one more.
Just on response to, in the work with the male, when you present the result, do we present how many girls were married after 18 years of age, or how many fathers helped the married of their daughters after 18? Means what is the presentation to the, what do you mention?
The presentation of the findings, whether we present how many, I think we presented how many girls are married before 18.
Sure, I'll respond.
I think with respect to thinking about the timelines and what's really realistic, I think sometimes when we're in research, and especially if you receive funding, we're complicit in some ways with it, because there's a little bit of posturing in the sense that, oh, we can get it done, we can get it done, but I think we do need to be more realistic, and I think that that's maybe a part that on the research side that we can play, to be realistic, to put in the right types of timelines. I mean, I guess it would have to be a collective action, though, because your first mover is always going to be the one that would get it. But it's something, I think it's an important point to bring up.
Okay, so about planning, I'll just avoid this whole question of timelines. I mean, obviously more time is always better, but you never have it, right? So that's just a fact. But I'll just, so whenever you're starting a project, whenever you're either doing data collection, either for an evaluation type of work, or even if it's not an evaluation of a program, if you're doing other kind of scientific work, I'll just say that personally, I learn a lot from that planning process, right? So just of the subject matter of what you're trying to work on, you just learn so much. And that's, I think, just an invaluable part of it, because as researchers, you always come in saying that I know a lot about the subject. And whenever you go through a whole process of planning a new project, you just go through this thing that maybe I don't know a whole lot again, but hopefully you do put in the effort to come up to speed, at least if not by yourself, rely on a whole bunch of other people and learn much more. And so I think Diva outlined some of the consultations we did. They were extremely helpful, and then we came up with big plans, and then we went to various schools in Haryana, and then we had to revise a lot of those plans. And because we also learned from the students, we learned from their teachers, we learned from the principals, we learned from the district education officers, we learned from a lot of people. And so ultimately, we always say, fingers crossed, we hope we came up with a big plan, and then good plan. And so that's my take on it. But your point about timelines and having good preparation is absolutely spot on.
Okay, I think we're nearing the end of our time, so I'll let Catherine close things up.
Always nice to get the last word in. I love that. I don't get it in anymore with my kids, so this is like the one space where I can. I'm going to comment on a few comments from the floor, and then just try and wrap up with some of my thoughts. There was a comment about, in fact, it was a question to the panel on multiple studies and synthetic reviews, and I think that actually there's a lot, this is a really interesting new frontier, and I think that we are, as a field, trying to look across studies, trying to look across evidence, trying to get more efficient, not keep repeating things where we already have good evidence. But methodologically, again, we're limited in some ways because it is easier to do it when studies follow similar approaches. And so, I mean, I was on a panel with Howard White a few months ago, and, you know, when you see the numbers of studies, let's say if you're taking something like SHGs, women's, you know, being part of an SHG, is it empowering? And, you know, it starts with like there's 5,000 studies that are at the start, and it gets up and only 7 make it to the criteria of what actually gets included in the review. So in some ways, we're getting better at that, but I think we also recognize that we need to innovate and find ways of capturing some of the different kinds of studies that are rigorous but using different traditions so that we're not losing so much of the richness when we do try to look across studies. That said, even in one study, I mean, most of the time, the studies I get, the quantitative and qualitative, it's like they're totally dancing at different parties. So in the same study, never mind sort of looking across studies. So, you know, there's one and it's interesting and it says this, and there's another and it's interesting and it says that, and then where do they connect? Well, there might be anecdotally some connection, or this correlation we found that in one case study. So the work that you're doing to try to actually combine and connect thoughtfully different approaches is actually not that common. And I would say that's, again, a frontier where I think some of the really innovative minds are really trying to look at how do you really merge you know, deep ethnographic work or qualitative work with really strong quantitative work. And I don't think we're there yet, so I think it's a really interesting space for new researchers and methodologists to get into. To this question of women and men, it's interesting you say that. Do we target women because they're easier to target, or do we target women because we're sort of biased, or we're not really working based on evidence? I'd say both. I think if you look at things like the push for female sterilization versus vasectomies, I mean, I think that's an example that it's easier to target women. So women are you know, engaged more in health seeking. You know, you collect women in self-help groups. So women as a group, in some ways, are easier to target. But also, I mean, the evidence is suggesting that for changing gender norms, there have been successes in targeting and working with men's groups. So I had the privilege last week of being in a meeting that the executive director of UN Women had convened, and what she talked about also was the increasing evidence that working with men's groups and working with men on gender issues was important, and how that was also creating some discomfort among women in the women's movement because it sort of was forcing us to rethink our approaches. And so I'm glad you flagged that, and I think it's something that the evidence can push us to, you know, in being reflexive about evidence, to also think about, you know, how are we maybe not being evidence-based. So I thought that was a really interesting comment. I think the fact that, you know, we had 3 presentations, and in not one of those presentations did we see data reflecting that a project had changed gender equity and improved it. You know, I mean, obviously we're just catching people when they're most excited about their work, which generally is at the beginning. So by the time the, you know, end-line data comes out, they're already designing some new studies, so you don't get them to speak at panels. But I mean, so I'm joking, but I think we are working in areas that are very difficult to change. We don't have a lot of sort of great, stellar, strong evidence about how you can shift things in 3 years radically using this intervention or that. So I think it's great that people are trying to find the right measures and to find measures that are attuned enough to detect often very difficult things to detect. And we're working in an area where change has been very difficult historically. But just to come back to the title, you know, we're talking about women's empowerment, and women's empowerment is not an intervention. Right? So women's empowerment is not an intervention. It's really about a movement. And so again, I come back to the points that I think as researchers, as evaluators, we need to think about how do we connect to movements. And I think we can find examples where research and evidence has influenced discourse. I think education in India is a great example, but that was also through connection to movements. And so not just, you know, I would encourage all of us to think in whatever way we are able, because not everybody, you know, we all have different capacities and talents, but to think about how can we actively seek out those connections and be part of that movement and try and have our evidence be used. And if we're not the one to take the evidence back to the grassroots, to some of those women on the ground or activists who are working, let's try and give it to them. So even if we're not the ones, but how do we build those bridges and not just sort of hope for diffusion? And on this point of ethics in evaluation, it's a plug here for the community of evaluators, because I think that these issues of pushing back when terms of reference aren't realistic, or when they don't include things like going back to the field or sharing, or having processes where the people who are being evaluated can also have some stake or ownership, so not having sufficient time, etc. I think those are all places where professional associations of evaluators can also sort of push back. And there is a group here, the Community of Evaluators. I'm a member of that group. They're trying to work on some of these issues in South Asia. So some of them are here, and they're looking to take new members. So that's a space where I think collectively one can argue and push back more easily than individually, because individually often it's private consultants or firms, and it's really hard to push back because you risk maybe losing the work. But as a collective, you can also set standards and goals, and so please join that collective and push for more ethical approaches to evaluation. So I found it hugely interesting. I think it was a great panel, and I learned a lot, and looking forward to also, will some of the materials be circulated, or can we get access some of the papers as they emerge? That would be great if there could maybe be a follow-up email with contact addresses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there should be tea outside, and one small request. You all have feedback forms in your packets. So if you could please fill those out, that would be great. We do take measurements quite seriously, and we apologize if they're